They stripped her badge from her chest and walked her toward the exit like she was nobody. 47 minutes later, military helicopters were circling the roof of the same hospital that just fired her. Claire Devlin had spent 6 weeks at Harrow Peak Medical Center in Caldwell Ridge, Wyoming, keeping her head down and her mouth shut. She was a trauma nurse, quiet, efficient, and careful not to let anyone know she'd once performed field surgery under mortar fire in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was trying to disappear. Dr. Roland Fitch made that impossible. Before we go any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like Claire's are what this channel is built for. Every week we bring you cinematic, emotional, edge-of-your-seat narratives that you won't find anywhere else. Hit the like button if this kind of story speaks to you, and drop a comment below telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's get back to Claire Devlin, the woman everyone underestimated, and the night that changed everything at Harrow Peak. The morning. It all unraveled started like every other morning on the trauma floor, understaffed, overcrowded, and running on burned coffee and borrowed time. Claire arrived at 6:15, 20 minutes before her shift, the way she always did, because she'd learned long before nursing school that the first 15 minutes of any emergency environment tells you everything you need to know. She moved through the floor quietly, checking chart flags, noting which patients had been repositioned and which hadn't, counting the ventilator readings with her eyes before she even put down her bag. She'd been doing this for 6 weeks, and nobody had asked her why. Nobody had noticed. That was fine with her. Harrow Peak Medical Center was a Level 2 trauma facility, not the biggest in the region, but the only one within 90 miles of the chemical corridor that ran along the eastern edge of Caldwell Ridge. It served ranchers and factory workers and long-haul truckers, and it was perpetually short on nurses and perpetually long on administrative politics. The kind of place where the chief of surgery had more authority than the hospital board on a bad day, and Dr. Roland Fitch was exactly the kind of man who made sure everyone knew it. Fitch was 53, silver-haired, and moved through the hospital like he was walking a red carpet only he could see. He'd trained at Johns Hopkins, or claimed to, and he mentioned it often enough that the newer residents had stopped keeping count. He was technically skilled. Claire had watched him work, and she could see that. But he was the kind of technically skilled that had never been tested by anything worse than a difficult attending and a tough residency board. He'd never had to make a call with no equipment, no anesthesiologist, no backup, and someone dying in the dirt in front of him. That difference, Claire understood, was everything. For 6 weeks, she had watched him override nursing assessments without reading them. She had watched him dismiss lab flags and wave off monitor alerts with the casual confidence of a man who had never been wrong in a way that left a mark. She had documented everything, quietly, in her personal notes, because that's what you do when you can't fight directly. You build a record and you wait. She hadn't planned to say anything that morning. The patient in Bay 4 was a 41-year-old man named Dennis Pryor, a shift foreman from the Halcott processing facility east of town, who'd come in the night before with abdominal pain that the overnight team had logged as probable kidney stones and scheduled for imaging in the morning. Claire had looked at his intake chart at 6:22 a.m. and something in the numbers made her stop. His pressure had dropped 4 points overnight. His respiratory rate was slightly elevated. Neither number was alarming on its own. Together, with the location and nature of the pain, they told a different story. She found Fitch at the nurse's station at 6:40, reviewing discharge paperwork for a patient in Bay 7. Dr. Fitch, she kept her voice even. Dennis Pryor, Bay 4. I think we need to move his imaging up. Fitch didn't look up from the paperwork. He's scheduled for 9. His pressure's dropped since admission. Combined with his respiratory pattern and the pain location, I think we might be looking at something vascular rather than urologic. He looked up then, slowly, in the way that some surgeons do when they want you to understand how much your interruption is costing them. You think? Yes. You're a nurse. That's correct. He set the paperwork down and turned to face her fully, and Claire recognized the performance immediately. The slight straightening of posture, the measured pause, all of it designed to remind everyone within earshot of the hierarchy. 2 residents were pretending to work at the far end of the station. A charge nurse named Patricia Ogden had gone very still near the medication cabinet. Devlin, Fitch said. "I've reviewed his chart. The attending who admitted him has 30 years of emergency medicine. The overnight team cleared him. And you," he glanced at her badge, "have been here 6 weeks. So I'm going to ask you to let the people who are actually responsible for this patient manage his care." Claire held his gaze. "I'm not questioning his admission. I'm flagging a change in his overnight data that I think warrants a second look." "Noted." He picked up his paperwork again. "That'll be all?" She stood there for 2 seconds longer than was comfortable, then walked back to Bay 4. She checked Pryor's vitals herself, manually, not just from the monitor. His radial pulse was slightly weaker than his last recorded reading. She documented it. She flagged the note to the attending of record. She did everything inside the protocol, everything that a nurse was supposed to do, and then she went back to her rounds and kept watching. At 7:15, Fitch was in Bay 4. At 7:22, he overrode the imaging order and cleared Pryor to wait until 9 a.m. as originally scheduled. At 7:40, Claire was at the station again. "Dr. Fitch?" Her voice was quieter this time, not because she was backing down, but because the situation had changed and she needed him to actually hear her. "I need you to look at his pulse ox trend over the last 40 minutes. It's not dropping dramatically, but the trajectory. I was just with him." Fitch's voice had gone flat, the performance gone, replaced by something colder. "He's comfortable. His pain is managed. His imaging will happen at 9 as scheduled, and then we'll have an actual clinical picture instead of a nursing hunch." The word landed precisely the way he intended it to. Patricia Ogden was watching from across the station. One of the residents had found somewhere else to be. "It's not a hunch," Claire said. "It's pattern recognition based on data that's in his chart. I'm asking you to look at the numbers." "And I'm telling you I've looked at the numbers." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "And I'm also telling you that this is the second time this week you've second-guessed a surgical decision that wasn't yours to make. You've been here 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Do you understand what that means in terms of what you know about how we do things here?" "I understand what it means," she said. "I also understand what a dropping pulse pressure looks like." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, something more deliberate than anger. "Give me your badge." The station went silent. "Excuse me?" Claire said. "Your badge." He held out his hand, palm up. "You're suspended pending a review of your conduct. Insubordination, interference with clinical decision-making, and a documented pattern of overstepping your scope of practice. HR will contact you." Claire looked at him for a moment. She thought about Dennis Pryor in Bay 4. She thought about the 7 things she could say right now that would be satisfying and useless. She thought about 6 weeks of documentation sitting on her personal phone. She unclipped her badge and placed it in his hand. "Document this," she said quietly. "Everything. Because when something happens to that patient, I want there to be a record of this exact conversation." Fitch's jaw tightened. "Security will escort you out." She didn't wait for security. She picked up her bag from under the station desk, walked to the locker room, and changed out of her scrubs into the jeans and gray Henley she'd worn in. She moved through the motions the way she'd learned to move through the worst moments, steadily, efficiently, without letting anything show on her face. She'd had worse mornings. She'd had mornings where losing a badge was the least of what she lost. She was in the main corridor, 30 feet from the lobby exit, when the first ambulance radio crackled through the overhead speaker system. Not a routine patch. The voice on the radio was clipped and fast, the cadence of someone managing a situation that was already beyond containment. Claire stopped walking without deciding to stop. "Harrow Peak, this is Caldwell Ridge EMS Unit 7. We are declaring a mass casualty event. Explosion at Halcott Processing, Eastern Corridor. We have confirmed multiple critical injuries, possible chemical exposure, structure collapse. First units are 4 minutes out. Advise on capacity." The lobby ahead of her had gone still. A woman at the reception desk was reaching for her phone. An orderly near the entrance doors stood frozen, tray of supplies in his hands. Claire turned around. She didn't think about the badge. She didn't think about Roland Fitch or the review or the HR call that was supposedly coming. She thought about the voice on that radio. 4 minutes, multiple criticals, possible chemical exposure. And she thought about what the trauma floor looked like 45 minutes ago, and she knew exactly what was about to happen to it. She walked back through the corridor at the pace she used to walk toward incoming helicopters, which was faster than most people ran. The ER was already in the early stages of the particular chaos that comes in the first 2 minutes of a mass casualty notification. Not full panic yet, but the tight, jagged energy of people who've trained for something and are now suddenly in it. A charge nurse was on the radio. 2 residents were pulling supply carts. Someone was calling the surgical floor. Claire moved to the main trauma board and looked at it for 3 seconds. 4 active bays. 2 post-procedure patients who could be moved. Bay 6 had a patient who'd been awaiting discharge for 2 hours. Patricia. She caught the charge nurse by the arm. Bay 6 needs to move to the family waiting area. They're discharge ready. Bay 3's patient can go to step down. You need both those bays clear in the next 3 minutes. Patricia Ogden stared at her. You're suspended. I know. Claire released her arm. Clear the bays. She moved to the supply wall and started pulling without waiting for permission. Chest seals, decompression needles, tourniquet kits, the burn supplies that were always stocked on the second shelf, but never in the right order. So began organizing them on the empty triage cart by injury type, by the sequence she knew the injuries would come in, because she'd seen what an industrial explosion did to human bodies, and she knew exactly what they were about to face. Behind her, she heard Patricia moving toward Bay 6. The first ambulance hit the bay doors 40 seconds later. The patient was a man, mid-40s, blast injuries to his left side, his left arm wrapped in a pressure dressing that was already soaked through. The paramedic was calling vitals as they came through the door. BP 88/60, heart rate 124, oxygen sat 91 and falling. Claire was already at the gurney. Tension pneumothorax, she said, not to anyone in particular. Left side. He needs a needle decompression now, before anything else. The resident who'd moved to the gurney hesitated. He was young. Claire put him at 2nd year, maybe 3rd, and he was looking at her with the expression of someone who knew she was right and wasn't sure he was allowed to agree with her. Bay 1, she said to the paramedic. Move him. She looked at the resident. Do you have the needle? He reached for the tray. Yeah. Then let's go. They moved. The needle went in. The tension released. The patient climbed 3 points in 90 seconds. And the resident looked at her like she'd done something extraordinary, and she looked back at him like he needed to focus because there were 4 more ambulances in the bay. There were actually 6. The next 40 minutes were the kind of 40 minutes that exist outside of regular time, compressed and endless simultaneously, the way extreme situations always felt to her, the way combat had felt. She moved between bays without stopping, reading injury patterns before the paramedics finished their reports, calling interventions before residents had finished processing the presentation. She wasn't doing it to show anyone anything. She was doing it because there were people dying in front of her and she knew how to stop it. She identified a delayed internal bleed on a 28-year-old woman who'd walked in from the parking lot with what looked like minor blast injuries and was 20 minutes from coding. She guided a resident through an improvised airway procedure when the standard approach failed, and the anesthesiologist was already in with a critical in Bay 2. She caught a chemical exposure that the intake team had logged as smoke inhalation and redirected the treatment protocol before it caused secondary damage. She did not think about Roland Fitch. At some point, she became aware that he was there. She registered him at the edge of her vision, standing near the nursing station, watching. She did not look at him directly. She did not have time. At some point, she became aware that Dennis Pryor from Bay 4 was being rushed to emergency surgery. She heard the words aortic dissection and felt something cold and precise move through her, and then she moved on to the next patient because that was all she could do now. The chaos had a shape, and she was inside it, and she knew how to work inside it. It was at the 50-minute mark, when the immediate critical wave had been managed, and the ER had shifted from crisis to sustained emergency operations, that she heard the sound. It came from outside, a rhythmic mechanical thud that she recognized before she consciously identified it. Rotor blades, multiple, heavy, not news helicopters. The frequency was wrong for that, too deep, too rhythmic. She was standing near the ambulance bay doors, and she looked up through the clerestory windows at the strip of sky visible above the roofline. 2 dark shapes crossed it moving fast, and her body knew what they were before her mind fully processed it. Military. Utility helicopters, UH-60 variants, by the sound. She stood very still. Around her, the ER continued its controlled chaos. Nurses calling orders, monitors beeping, someone wheeling a patient toward imaging. Nobody else seemed to have registered the sound yet, Or if they had, they'd filed it under emergency response, National Guard, disaster relief. Reasonable assumptions. Claire's assumption was different, and she couldn't have explained exactly why, except that 6 years of operational experience had taught her that when military helicopters arrived somewhere she was, it was rarely a coincidence. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number, Wyoming area code. She answered it. Devlin. The voice on the other end was male, measured, the particular flatness of someone with command authority. Don't react to this call. You're in a public space. Just listen. Her hand tightened on the phone. Outside, the helicopters were getting louder. My name is not relevant right now. What is relevant is that we've been looking for you for 14 months, and we've found you, and there are things you need to know before the next 20 minutes happen. The ambulance bay doors opened. 2 paramedics came through with another gurney. Claire stepped aside automatically, her eyes on the patient, her phone at her ear. What things? She said, her voice completely level. The investigation into your discharge was reopened 8 months ago. The findings are not what was put in your record. There are people in your current facility who knew where you were and who you were before you were hired. That was not an accident. The helicopters were directly overhead now. Through the clerestory windows, she could see them beginning to circle, and she understood they were looking for a landing position. The roof pad, probably, if Harrow Peak had one, or the back access road if they didn't. Across the trauma floor, through the interior window that looked into the main corridor, she saw a figure she didn't recognize. A man in civilian clothes moving with the specific purposefulness of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had been here before. He was followed by 2 others. Devlin, the voice on the phone again. Are you still with me? She was watching the man in the corridor. He'd stopped near the nursing station entrance. He was scanning the trauma floor. His eyes found her. Yes, she said. I'm still with you. The man in the corridor held her gaze for a moment, then turned and said something to the person behind him. Good. A pause. Because what happens in the next few minutes is going to feel like a lot at once. I need you to stay exactly where you are. On the floor above her, she could feel the vibration of something large and heavy making contact with the roof. Claire Devlin stood in the middle of the emergency room that had fired her 2 hours ago, patients on every side, her badge gone, her name in an HR file, and somewhere above her, military helicopters were setting down on the hospital she no longer officially worked in. And the voice on her phone belonged to someone who'd just told her that none of the last 14 months had been an accident. She put the phone in her pocket. She checked the airway on the patient in Bay 3. She waited. She didn't have to wait long. The man she'd seen through the corridor window came through the trauma floor doors 2 minutes later, and up close he was different from what she'd expected. Not in uniform, which she'd half anticipated, but in a dark jacket over a collared shirt, the kind of clothes that were deliberately unremarkable. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with the particular economy of movement that came from decades of physical discipline that the body kept even when the active service ended. Behind him came a woman in her 30s carrying a tablet and a hard-sided case, and a younger man who stationed himself just inside the door and didn't move again. The man walked directly to Claire. He didn't extend his hand, he didn't look around the room. He stopped 3 feet from her and spoke quietly enough that the nurses 2 bays over couldn't have heard him over the noise of the floor. Major Devlin. She hadn't heard that word in 14 months. It landed differently than she expected. Not like a title, more like a key turning in something she'd thought was permanently locked. I'm not a major anymore, she said. That's one of the things we're here to discuss. He glanced at the bay behind her, where a resident was managing a chest wound on a man who was going to be fine. Can you step away from the floor for 5 minutes? No, she said. I can't. He absorbed that without reacting. Then I'll talk while you work. She turned back to the bay and he followed, keeping to her left where he was out of the resident's way. The woman with the tablet stayed near the wall. Claire checked the patient's pressure reading, noted it in the chart, and adjusted the flow rate on the IV line. My name is Garrett Wills, the man said. I'm with the Army Inspector General's office, not active duty, contracted investigator, which means I have more flexibility than a uniformed officer in terms of where I can go and what I can compel. The call I just got, Claire said, not looking at him. Was that you? That was my associate. We wanted 30 seconds of preparation before I walked in. You could have called me earlier, before today. We could have, he said. We didn't, for reasons that will make sense in about 4 minutes. She moved to the next bay. A woman with blast injuries to her right leg, already stabilized, waiting for surgical consult. Claire checked the wound dressing, noted the time, moved on. Wills kept pace. The formal investigation into your separation was reopened 8 months ago by the IG's office following a whistleblower complaint from inside the 44th Medical Brigade. The complaint alleged that the documentation supporting your court-martial was fabricated, and that the individuals who fabricated it were connected to a procurement fraud network operating across 3 bases. Claire was quiet for a moment. She'd known the documentation was fabricated. She'd known it from the moment she saw it, because she had been there, and the events described in those documents had not happened the way they were described. What she hadn't known was whether anyone else would ever know. "Who filed the complaint?" she asked. "I can't tell you that yet." "Is that person safe?" He paused. "Yes." She noted the pause. 8 months, she said. "You've been investigating for 8 months." "Yes. And you showed up today because of the explosion." "We showed up today because the explosion created a situation where we couldn't wait any longer." He lowered his voice another degree. 3 days ago, we identified a connection between the procurement network and this hospital. Specifically, between a defense contractor named Harlow Vance Group and the financial structures of Harrow Peak Medical Center. We were 48 hours from executing a coordinated action when the Halcott plant went up. Claire stopped walking. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since he'd started talking. He held her gaze without flinching, which told her something. "You're telling me this hospital is connected to what happened to me in the Army. I'm telling you the people who destroyed your record didn't stop at your record. They built something larger, and this facility is part of it, and you ended up here." He paused. "Because someone put you here." The trauma floor around them continued its controlled noise. Monitors, voices, wheels on linoleum. Claire was aware of all of it, and none of it. "That's not possible," she said. I found this job through a standard placement service." The placement service is a subsidiary of a company whose board includes 2 former Harlow Vance executives. He said it without inflection, the way people say things they've had to say multiple times and have learned to deliver without editorializing. "We're not alleging you were put here as part of a conspiracy against you personally. We think you were placed here because someone wanted to control where you were while the investigation you didn't know existed was in progress." She stood with that for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all she could afford. "Okay," she said, and turned back to the floor. Wills blinked. Whatever response he'd been prepared for, that wasn't it. "Okay," he repeated. "I have patience." She moved toward Bay 5, where a new admission was being wheeled in. "You can keep talking." He followed her. She gave him credit for not hesitating. The new admission was a teenage boy, 16, 17, she couldn't tell, with burns along his right arm and neck from what the paramedic described as a secondary flash fire at the plant perimeter. He was conscious and terrified, which was actually a good sign, and he was trying to be brave about it in the way that young men did, biting down on the pain and looking at the ceiling and not letting himself make noise. Claire put her hand on his left arm, the unburned one, before she did anything else. "Hey." She waited until he looked at her. "I'm Claire, I've got you. This is going to hurt for a little while longer, and then we're going to make it hurt a lot less. Can you tell me your name?" "Jalen," he said. His voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. "Jalen. Good. Are you having any trouble breathing?" "No." "Okay. I'm going to look at the burn while I talk to you. Don't look at it if you don't want to." He looked at the ceiling. She examined the burn, partial thickness, significant area, going to need wound care and pain management and monitoring for infection, but not life-threatening. She ordered the pain protocol and the wound kit and told the resident beside her exactly what she wanted and in what order. Behind her, Wills was still there. Patient, which she respected. "There's something else," she said, when she'd finished giving orders. "There usually is. Roland Fitch." He waited a beat. "He's not just a surgeon with a bad bedside manner. He's been on Harlow Vance's consulting roster for 4 years. He receives quarterly payments through a medical education LLC that does no actual medical education. We think his role was to manage staff turnover on this floor, specifically to ensure that anyone with military medical credentials who might recognize what was happening in the billing and procurement structures didn't stay long enough to notice." Claire looked up from Jalen's chart. She thought about 6 weeks of watching Fitch operate, the casual dismissals, the pattern of targeting nurses who pushed back, the specific, disproportionate reaction he'd had to her. Not just impatience, not just arrogance, but something that had felt, in retrospect, more deliberate than that. She thought about Dennis Pryor, who was currently in surgery because his aortic dissection had gone unimaged for 90 minutes after she'd tried to flag it. "He knew who I was," she said. "We believe he did." "Yes." "And he fired me this morning to get me out of the building before you arrived." "Almost certainly." She looked back at Jalen, who was staring at the ceiling with his jaw clenched while the resident began the wound care. She adjusted the pain medication rate without being asked, because she could see in the set of his shoulders that the current dose wasn't touching it yet. "He didn't know you were coming today," she said. "Nobody knew about the explosion. He fired me because—" She stopped, worked it through. "Because you were getting close. He was already moving to clear the floor." "That's our assessment." "How many nurses before me?" Wills was quiet for a moment. "In the last 2 years? 4 that we've identified. 3 resigned after documented incidents with Fitch. 1 filed a complaint that was buried by the administrator's office. 4 nurses. 4 people who'd noticed something, or might have, and had been pushed out before they could look too closely." Claire didn't say anything about that. There wasn't anything to say that would be adequate. "What happens now?" she asked. "Federal investigators are already in the building. They came in with our team. They're in the administrative offices." He checked his watch. "Right now. Hospital CEO Warren Colt has been served. We have a court order for the financial records." "Fitch?" "He's been informed that he's under investigation. He hasn't been arrested. That comes later, pending the full document review." "He's still in this building?" "Yes." Claire filed that information and moved on. There were 3 more patients she needed to check, and the burn cases from the Halcott site were still coming in, and whatever was happening with federal investigators in the administrative wing was happening whether she was thinking about it or not. She spent the next 40 minutes doing what she'd been doing since she walked back through those doors, moving, assessing, directing, catching things before they became catastrophic. The resident who'd done the needle decompression earlier had found his footing by now and was working well. She shifted more to him deliberately, coaching from slightly further back, because he needed to be building confidence, and she could see he had good instincts under the panic. A second wave of Halcott casualties arrived at the 90-minute mark. Workers who'd been further from the primary explosion and had waited for secondary triage at the site before transport. Less critical individually, but more numerous. And several had respiratory complications from the chemical release that required careful monitoring and specific intervention protocols. Claire had managed chemical exposure casualties before. She didn't announce this. She simply moved through the cases with the efficiency of someone who'd done it before, and the residents followed her lead, and at some point she noticed that Patricia Ogden had stopped looking at her with the expression of someone waiting for her to be removed and had started looking at her with something else entirely. It was somewhere in that second wave that Roland Fitch reappeared. He came onto the trauma floor from the internal stairwell, not from the main entrance, and he was moving with a controlled urgency that looked nothing like his usual performance. His face was composed, but his eyes were doing something different, tracking the room, registering the federal presence, calculating. He saw Wills first, then he saw Claire. He stopped in the middle of the floor with patients and staff moving around him, and for a moment the mask was entirely gone. What was underneath it wasn't rage or guilt or fear exactly. It was the specific expression of a man who has been managing a situation for years and has just realized the situation has ended. Then the mask came back. He walked toward her. "Devlin." His voice was controlled. "I need you to— "I know about Harlow Vance," she said. He stopped. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I know about the consulting payments. I know why you fired me this morning, and I know it had nothing to do with my clinical performance." The floor around them had gone slightly quieter, not silent. The monitors and machines continued uninterrupted, but the human voices had dropped. Fitch's jaw worked for a moment. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know Dennis Pryor almost died because you didn't want me on this floor long enough to see something I wasn't even looking for yet." She said it evenly, without heat, because the anger was there, but it wasn't useful right now. "I know 4 nurses before me were pushed out the same way. This is—" He started, then stopped. He was looking past her at Wills, who had appeared at her shoulder. He was looking at the woman with the tablet, who had moved closer. He was doing the math. Dr. Fitch, Wills's voice was pleasantly neutral. I'm going to ask you not to leave the building. A formal interview has been requested through your attorney, and we'd like that to happen today. Fitch's eyes came back to Claire. Something moved through them that might have been, in a different man, something like regret. But it wasn't regret. It was recalculation. This isn't over, he said. You're right, Claire said. It isn't. He turned and walked back toward the stairwell, and Wills's associate fell into step 20 feet behind him, quiet and unhurried, the way surveillance worked when it was done correctly. Claire turned back to the floor. There was a patient in Bay 7 who needed her. The next hour was quieter, relatively. The mass casualty peak had passed. The critical cases were in surgery or stabilized, and the floor had shifted from crisis management into sustained emergency operations. Claire worked through it methodically, the way she always worked, checking and rechecking, catching the small things that got missed in busy periods, making sure the residents were eating something and drinking water because burned-out residents made errors and errors cost people. She was at the supply station reordering the depleted chest seal inventory when Patricia Ogden appeared beside her. The charge nurse was quiet for a moment, like she was deciding something. Bay 4 patient, she finally said. Dennis Pryor. He's out of surgery. Claire looked up. They got to it in time, Patricia said. Barely, but they got to it. Claire looked back at the supply inventory. Good. Another silence. I put your observations in his chart. The ones from this morning. The ones Fitch dismissed. Claire was quiet for a moment. You didn't have to do that. Yeah. Patricia picked up a supply order form and looked at it without reading it. I kind of did. That was all either of them said about it. The federal presence in the hospital had become impossible to ignore by early afternoon. There were investigators in the administrative wing and investigators in medical records, and at one point Claire saw 2 people in FBI windbreakers in the main corridor walking with a hospital attorney who looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days. The nursing staff had heard enough fragments to understand that something significant was happening in the building's upper structures, even if the full picture hadn't been shared with them yet. At 2:15, Garrett Wills found Claire in the small supply room off the main trauma corridor where she'd gone to do a count of remaining trauma supplies, and also, briefly, to stand still in a quiet space for 90 seconds without anyone needing something from her. He stepped in and closed the door partway. I need to tell you something before it comes from somewhere else, he said. She set down the supply clipboard. Okay. Warren Colt, the CEO. He's cooperating. He's been cooperating for about 3 hours since we served him. He's given us documentation that goes further up than we anticipated. He paused. Some of what he's provided involves the specifics of your case, the original court-martial proceedings. Claire waited. The officer who prepared the primary documentation against you, Colonel Marcus Dre, he's been under separate investigation by the DoD for 11 months. What Colt's given us fills a gap we've been trying to close for most of that time. It links Dre's actions directly to Harlow Vance. He looked at her steadily. What was done to your record, Devlin? It wasn't incidental. You were specifically targeted because you were present at a procurement inspection that would have exposed the contract fraud. You were the witness they couldn't afford. She had known this, in the way you know things you can't prove and can't afford to dwell on. Hearing it stated plainly, with evidence behind it, was a different experience. Dre, eh? She said. Where is he now? Retired. Virginia. He'll be served by end of day. She nodded once, picked up the supply clipboard. There's more, Wills said. She looked at him. Your record is being formally reviewed for expungement. The IG has already drafted the recommendation. Your rank, Major, was never legitimately revoked, under the framework we're working from. The separation was procedurally invalid from the start. He paused. This is going to take some time to process through the formal channels, but the direction is clear. Claire stood with that for a moment. The supply room was very small. Outside the door, she could hear the sounds of the trauma floor, the rhythm she'd been working inside all day, the rhythm she'd been working inside for most of her adult life in one form or another. What do you need from me? She asked. A formal statement. When you're ready, no rush today. You've got enough happening, but in the next few days. Fine. He nodded, started to turn toward the door. Wills. He stopped. The placement service, she said. The one that placed me here. The subsidiary with the Harlow Vance board members. What about it? How many other hospitals? He was quiet for just a beat too long. We're still mapping it, he said, which meant the answer was more than one, and possibly significantly more than that. And he wasn't ready to tell her the full number yet because the investigation was still in progress, and the number was probably the kind of number that, once stated, changed the shape of everything. Okay, she said. She went back to the floor. At 4 o'clock, a general officer walked through the front entrance of Harrow Peak Medical Center. Claire didn't see it happen. She was in Bay 2 with a patient who'd developed a secondary complication from the chemical exposure, a bronchospasm that needed immediate attention and had chosen to develop at the exact moment the attending was in surgery. She managed it, talked the resident through the intervention, and was still at the bedside when Patricia appeared in the bay doorway with an expression Claire had never seen on her before. Patricia stopped, started again. There's a general officer in the lobby with his aide. He asked for you by name. Claire checked her patient's oxygen saturation, 96 and climbing, stable. Which name? She asked. Patricia's expression shifted into something even harder to read. Major Devlin. The floor outside Bay 2 had gotten quiet in that way that floors got quiet when something unusual had entered the space. Not silence, just a change in the frequency of the noise, the way a room changes when someone unexpected walks in. Claire came out of Bay 2. At the far end of the trauma floor, standing at the entrance from the main corridor with his hands clasped behind his back and 4 people flanking him, was a man in Army service uniform with the 2 stars of a major general on his shoulders. He was in his late 50s, lean and weathered, with the kind of face that had spent time in places that left marks. His aide stood to his right. 2 MPs stood further back. Garrett Wills stood to the general's left, and he gave Claire a slight nod when he saw her come out of the bay. The general walked toward her. He walked through the middle of the trauma floor, past the bays, past the nursing station, past residents who had stopped moving and were trying not to stare. And he stopped in front of Claire Devlin, who was standing in borrowed scrubs with a stethoscope around her neck and no badge on her chest. And he looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has been searching for something for a long time and has finally found it in an unexpected place. Major Devlin, he said. His voice carried. He didn't try to lower it. General, she said, I'm Randall Okafor, Deputy Inspector General, U.S. Army. He didn't offer his hand. He stood with the particular stillness of command. I've been briefed on today's events here and on your actions on this floor. Around them, the trauma floor had gone as quiet as a working ER ever got. Nurses, residents, Patricia Ogden at the station, a paramedic who'd come in with a transfer and hadn't left yet. I'm also here, Okafor continued, because the formal review of your separation from service reached its preliminary conclusion 40 minutes ago, and I wanted to deliver that in person. Claire said nothing. Her hands were very still. The proceedings that resulted in your separation from the United States Army were conducted in violation of military law. The documentation was fabricated. The chain of command that authorized the proceedings was itself compromised. He paused. You were not dishonorably separated from service, Major. You were illegally removed from service. There is a difference, and that difference is going to be reflected in every document that bears your name. The supply room conversation with Wills had prepared her, intellectually. Being told by a 2-star general in the middle of the emergency room that had fired her 11 hours ago was a different experience than being intellectually prepared. She kept her face even. She owed herself that much. The full restoration process takes time, Okafor said. But I want you to hear this clearly. As of this moment, the Army's position is that you never stopped being a major. The rank, the record, the benefits, all of it. We're starting the paperwork today. A sound moved through the room. Not a collective gasp, quieter than that. More like a shift in pressure, the way a room changes when something true gets said in it. Claire became aware that she was being looked at by every person on the floor. She was aware that Roland Fitch was not among them, that he was somewhere in this building with a federal investigator tracking his movements and an attorney who was not going to be able to undo what the next weeks would bring. She was aware that Dennis Pryor was 3 floors up in a recovery room, alive, because she had documented what she'd seen, and she hadn't walked away from it even when she was told to. She was aware that there were still 2 patients on this floor who needed follow-up in the next hour and a supply inventory that wasn't going to complete itself. General Okafor was watching her. "Thank you, sir," she said. Her voice was level. "I need to finish my shift." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but close to it. The aide beside him wrote something on a notepad. "Of course," Okafor said. He stepped back, which was not something 2-star generals did very often for anyone. "We'll be in touch." Claire turned back to the floor. She had taken 4 steps toward the nursing station when her pager, the hospital pager that technically she was no longer authorized to carry, went off with a priority code she recognized. Bay 6, cardiac event. The patient who'd been there since morning, a 63-year-old woman who'd been waiting for a cardiology consult that kept getting delayed because of the mass casualty volume. Claire was already moving. Behind her, she heard Patricia Ogden calling the code. She heard feet on the linoleum. She heard the particular urgency of a resuscitation being assembled, and she was through the bay doors before the cart was in position. The woman in Bay 6 had a name, Margaret Hollis, and she had 3 adult children whose numbers were in her chart, and she had a cardiology history that Claire had read twice this morning and flagged for follow-up and been ignored. She was not going to be ignored now. "Get me the cart and someone who can run the board," Claire said, pulling on gloves. "And someone call cardiology. Not a consult request, a direct call. Tell them we have a STEMI presentation and we needed them 4 hours ago." The resident beside her, a different one now, a 3rd year she hadn't worked with today, moved without hesitation. They worked. Margaret Hollis's heart had its own opinion about how the afternoon was going to go, and for 11 minutes it was a very strong opinion, and Claire worked against it with everything she had, calling interventions, reading the monitor, adjusting. And there was a moment somewhere in the middle of those 11 minutes where the rhythm on the screen did something that made the resident go very still beside her. And Claire looked at it, and she made a call that was not in the standard protocol, a modification based on something she'd seen in a field hospital 6 years ago under circumstances she'd never been able to put in an official report. And it was the right call. Margaret Hollis's heart changed its mind. By the time the cardiologist arrived, 8 minutes after the direct call, which was 4 times faster than any previous response today, the situation was managed. It wasn't clean. It wasn't the kind of save that looked impressive from the outside. It was messy and imperfect. And it left both Claire and the 3rd-year resident slightly shaking from the sustained intensity of it, and Margaret Hollis was going to need a procedure and several days of monitoring and a very serious conversation with her cardiologist about why she'd delayed seeking care for the symptoms she'd had for 2 weeks. But she was alive. The cardiologist, a compact woman named Dr. Simone Rask, who had clearly run from wherever she'd been in the building, stood in the bay doorway looking at the monitor and then at Claire. "What did you give her at the 11-minute mark?" she asked. "That's not on the standard protocol." "Modified dosing based on her weight and the specific rhythm pattern," Claire said. "I'll document the full rationale." Rask looked at her for a moment. "Where did you learn that modification?" "Field experience," Claire said. Rask absorbed that, nodded slowly. "It worked." "This time," Claire said, "document it and evaluate it properly before you use it again. I'm not saying it's right for every presentation." Rask looked at her for another moment. "Who are you?" Claire pulled off her gloves. "I'm the nurse they fired this morning." She left the bay. The corridor outside was quiet, relatively, for late afternoon in a hospital that had managed a mass casualty event and a federal investigation in the same day. The general and his aide were gone, presumably to whatever secure space had been arranged for the formal proceedings. Garrett Wills was somewhere in the administrative wing. The FBI winebreakers she'd seen earlier were no longer visible, which probably meant they'd moved deeper into the document retrieval process. At the nursing station, Patricia Ogden was on the phone. When she saw Claire come out of Bay 6, she ended the call and held something across the counter. It was a temporary access badge. It had Claire's name on it. "Administrator approved it 20 minutes ago," Patricia said. "Before you ask, yes, it was after the general talked to them." Claire looked at the badge. It was a piece of plastic with her name on it, and it meant she could continue to walk through the doors of this particular building, which was not, in the scheme of what had happened today, the most significant thing anyone had given her. But she took it. She clipped it to the neck of the borrowed scrubs. Patricia was looking at her with the expression of someone who had several things they wanted to say and had decided, for now, to say none of them. Claire appreciated that. "What time is the next supply inventory due?" Claire asked. Patricia blinked. 6. "I'll do it." She went to get the clipboard. She was halfway through the count when she heard the first raised voice from the stairwell. Not a patient, not a code, but the sharp, controlled anger of a man who had spent the day being followed and was now being told something he didn't want to hear. The voice was Fitch's. It cut off abruptly, the way voices cut off when a door closes or someone says something that ends the conversation. Then it was quiet. Claire wrote down the count for the chest seal inventory, 14 units, which was not enough. She'd need to requisition more, and moved to the next shelf. Whatever was happening in that stairwell was happening. Whatever was happening in the administrative offices was happening. 14 months of her life had gone somewhere that felt like a dead end, and it turned out it had been going somewhere else entirely, somewhere she hadn't been able to see from inside it, and now that somewhere else was arriving all at once, and she was standing in a supply room counting chest seals because that was the thing that needed doing. She was 3 shelves from the end of the count when her phone rang again. Unknown number. Different area code this time. Virginia, she thought, though she wasn't certain. She answered it. The voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in 4 years. Female, precise, with the particular cadence of someone who had once held very significant authority and had not entirely let go of the habit of using it. "Claire," the voice said. "It's Hartwell. Colonel Dana Hartwell. Her former commanding officer. The woman who had signed off on Claire's deployment to the inspection that had started all of this, and who had disappeared from Claire's professional world 2 weeks after the court-martial, transferred to a posting in Germany with a speed that had felt, at the time, like abandonment. "Colonel," Claire said, "I'm not a colonel anymore." A brief pause. "I'm the whistleblower." The supply room was very small and very quiet. "I've been working with the IG's office for 11 months, Hartwell said. "I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry I didn't fight it harder in the beginning. I've been trying to—" Her voice caught slightly, which was something Claire had never heard from Dana Hartwell in 4 years of service. "There are things I need to explain to you, and I don't know if you'll want to hear them, but I need to say them." Claire stood in the supply room with the clipboard in her hand and 14 months of unanswered questions between her and the woman on the phone. "I'm listening," she said. Hartwell's voice on the phone had the texture of someone who had rehearsed an apology so many times that it had worn smooth in places and rough in others, the way repeated handling changes the surface of a thing. "I need you to understand the sequence," Hartwell said, "not as an excuse, just so you know what actually happened." Claire was still holding the supply clipboard. She set it on the shelf. "Go ahead." "The inspection at Keller Forward Base, the one you flagged the discrepancies on, I knew what you'd found before you filed the formal report. You came to me first, which was correct procedure. I told you to document it and submit through standard channels." A pause. "What I didn't tell you was that I'd already been approached 2 weeks before that by someone from Harlow Vance's government relations office." Claire said nothing. "They didn't threaten me directly. That's not how they operate. They made it clear that the procurement contracts supporting the 44th's operational budget for the next fiscal year were contingent on certain findings from the inspection cycle. It was presented as context, background, a friendly conversation." Hartwell's voice was steady, but there was something under it. "I told them I couldn't control what my personnel found or reported. I told them our process was independent, and then I walked away and told myself I'd handled it correctly." "But you didn't flag it," Claire said. "No, I didn't flag it. I was 2 years from retirement. I had a daughter starting college." She stopped. "I'm not asking you to understand that. I'm telling you what happened." The supply room was very quiet. Outside, the floor sounds continued. Monitors, footsteps, the distant percussion of a hospital managing the tail end of a mass casualty day. "When they moved against you," Hartwell continued, "it happened fast, faster than I expected. Within 72 hours of your report going in, I was informed that there was an investigation into a violation of inspection protocol. I was told the evidence was clear. I was told the best thing for the unit was to let the process proceed without interference from command." She paused. "I believed that if I pushed back, they'd come for me too, and I told myself that a compromised colonel was no use to anyone. I told myself you had good lawyers. I told myself, she stopped. I told myself a lot of things that kept me from doing what I should have done. Claire pressed the heel of her hand against the shelf edge. Not hard, just something solid to push against. When did you change your mind? She asked. About 14 months ago, right after your separation. A long pause. I was cleaning out your personnel file for transfer to the records office, standard administrative closeout, and there was a document in it that I hadn't signed and that bore my signature. Claire closed her eyes briefly. They'd forged your court-martial documentation, she said, and they'd used your signature. My signature on 2 supporting statements I never wrote, statements that corroborated the violations they'd manufactured. Hartwell's voice had gone flat with a controlled precision that Claire recognized from operational briefings, the tone Hartwell used when she was keeping emotion out of something by sheer discipline. That changed the calculation. It wasn't just that I'd been a coward. They'd made me a participant without my consent. And at that point I had 2 choices. You could have stayed quiet, Claire said. Yes. Everything they'd built was already in motion. You were already separated. They had no reason to look at me again. I could have retired in 18 months and never said anything. But you didn't. No. A beat. I contacted the IG's office 11 months ago. I gave them everything I had. My original meeting with Harlow Vance's representative, the forged documents, everything I knew about the inspection cycle, and the contract structures. It took 8 months for them to build a case strong enough to act on. And during that time I couldn't contact you because the investigation required… She stopped. They needed the scene clean. They needed Harlow Vance and the hospital network to believe you were isolated and unaware. Any contact from me could have burned the investigation, Claire said. Yes. 14 months. Claire had spent 14 months believing that Dana Hartwell, the officer she'd trusted more than anyone in 6 years of service, had either stood aside or actively cooperated. The truth was more complicated and less comfortable than either of those things, the way the truth usually was. Are you in Virginia? Claire asked. Yes. The IG told me Dre is being served today. He was served 2 hours ago. There was something in Hartwell's voice when she said that, not satisfaction exactly, more the release of a pressure that had been sustained too long. There are 4 others, 2 active duty, 2 retired, all connected to Harlow Vance's government contracting division. The DoD is coordinating with the FBI on the civilian side. She paused. Your record, Claire. They've already drafted the expungement. It's a formality at this point. The IG's recommendation is going up to the Secretary's office by end of week. Claire absorbed that. I need to get back to my floor, she said. A silence. Then, I know, I needed you to hear it from me. I heard it, Claire said. She picked up the clipboard. Thank you for making the call, Colonel. Dana, Hartwell said. I think, at this point, it's Dana. Claire didn't respond to that. She hung up and stood in the supply room for 11 more seconds, which was all she could afford, and then she went back to work. The supply count took another 20 minutes. She completed it methodically, every number correct, every notation clear, because that was the standard, and she held to it regardless of what else was happening. When she brought the clipboard back to the station, Patricia took it without comment and began processing the requisition order for the chest seal restock. The trauma floor was settling into its end-of-day rhythm, slower, heavier, the particular exhaustion of a unit that had absorbed something massive and was now coming down the other side of it. 2 of the Halcott explosion patients had been transferred to the ICU. 4 were in surgical recovery. The rest were distributed across the medical floors, monitored, stable, up. Jalen, the teenage boy with the burn injuries, had his mother with him now. Claire saw her through the bay window, a woman in a plant worker's uniform who'd clearly come straight from whatever worksite she'd been called away from, sitting in the chair beside his bed, and holding his unbandaged hand and not saying anything, just being there. Jalen was asleep. The pain management had finally done its job. Claire kept moving. At 6:45, Garrett Wills found her in the corridor near the imaging suite. He looked different than he had that morning, not less composed, but more tired, the controlled effect slightly worn at the edges. He'd been in administrative offices for hours, which Claire understood to be its own kind of exhausting. "We have a problem," he said, without preamble. She stopped walking. "Which one?" Fitch. He fell into step beside her, lowering his voice. He agreed to the interview, came in voluntarily, attorney present, 2 hours ago. We started with the Harlow Vance payments. His attorney anticipated that. They'd clearly prepared. He was cooperative, careful, admitted to the consulting relationship, had an explanation for the payment structure. That's not the problem, Claire said. No, the problem is what he gave us in exchange for his cooperation. Wills paused. He provided documentation of a separate set of transactions that he claims implicates the hospital's chief financial officer and 2 members of the board in a parallel fraud, falsified billing codes on military veterans' claims specifically. He's offering to be a cooperating witness in exchange for reduced exposure on his own charges. Claire processed that. And the documentation is real? Preliminary review suggests it is. Our financial forensics team is on it now. He paused. Which means Fitch is useful. Which means his attorney is already talking about the terms under which useful people get treated differently than useless ones. There it was. She'd known, intellectually, that this was how it worked. Investigations of this size ran on cooperation, and cooperation required incentive, and incentive meant that the people who had done harm sometimes emerged with less consequence than the harm they'd caused warranted. She knew this. She'd seen it before. Knowing it and having it applied to Roland Fitch, in this building today, were different experiences. What's his exposure? She asked. With cooperation? The Harlow Vance payments become a civil matter rather than criminal. The consulting fees were technically legal, ethically compromised, clearly, but there's no direct evidence he committed fraud himself. What he did was facilitate, create conditions, manage personnel. Wills's voice was carefully neutral. The charge that's harder to negotiate is Dennis Pryor. He delayed necessary treatment on a patient who nearly died because he wanted to remove me from this floor. That's our argument. His argument is that he made a clinical judgment that was consistent with the available evidence at the time. Your observations were flagged, and he reviewed them and disagreed. He looked at her. It's not a simple case. Clinical judgment calls are notoriously difficult to prosecute. Claire was quiet for a moment. He knew who I was, she said. He fired me to prevent an investigation, not because of my clinical conduct. If you can establish that the firing was connected to Harlow Vance's interest in removing me, the clinical decisions he made after that exist in a different context. That's exactly what we're trying to establish. The timing is there. He fired you 30 minutes before our team arrived, but the timeline alone isn't enough. He paused. We need something that puts his knowledge of our investigation prior to this morning, something that shows the firing was preemptive rather than coincidental. Claire thought about the 6 weeks, the pattern of dismissals, the specific targeting that had felt different from standard surgical ego, the way he'd looked at her that first week before he'd had any legitimate reason to find her performance objectionable. His first incident report on me, she said, week 2. He cited a documentation error that I went back and reviewed. I made a copy of the original before it went into my HR file because the version in my file was different from what I'd actually submitted. Wills had gone very still. Different how? The timestamp was altered. The original showed that I'd flagged a lab value and documented it 17 minutes before the attending saw it. The version in my file showed the documentation occurring after. It reversed the sequence and made it look like I'd post-documented to cover a miss. You have the original copy. On my personal phone, photographed the night before I would have lost access to the system. He looked at her with an expression that was several things at once. Why didn't you report the discrepancy immediately? Because at the time I thought it was Fitch protecting himself from a potential complaint. I didn't have the context to understand what it actually was. She met his eyes. I have it now. I need that photograph, he said. I know. She pulled out her phone. Who do I send it to? She sent the photograph to the address he provided, and then she sent a second photograph, a screen cap she'd taken of a text message on her first day at Harrow Peak from the placement coordinator, ways that she hadn't understood at the time, but that she'd kept because something about it had felt wrong. The coordinator had written, "Your placement has been confirmed by all relevant stakeholders. Please proceed as planned." It was a strange phrase for a nursing placement. She'd thought so at the time and filed it away. Wills read both images on his phone and looked up at her. When were you going to tell me about these? I just told you, she said. He made a sound that was almost, under different circumstances, a laugh. He sent both images forward and then pocketed his phone. Fitch's cooperation agreement is not finalized, he said. This complicates it. Good, she said, and meant it simply, without heat. She was at the nursing station updating her last chart notes of the shift when the overhead intercom paged her, not her name, but the trauma nurse designation for Bay 2, which meant something had changed with the patient she'd last seen an hour ago. She was through the bay doors in 30 seconds. The patient in Bay 2 was a man named Roy Tesler, a 58-year-old shift supervisor from Halcott Processing, who'd been admitted with blast injuries and a secondary pulmonary contusion that they'd been monitoring through the afternoon. His vitals had been acceptable, not strong, but stable within the range that the attending had been comfortable with. Now his respiratory rate was climbing and his pulse ox was dropping, and the third-year resident who'd paged was standing at the monitor with the specific expression of someone who knows something is wrong and is not yet certain what. Claire looked at the numbers. She listened to his chest, right side, then left. The left was different, not absent, but changed. Delayed hemothorax, she said. Left side. It's been accumulating since admission, probably a slow bleeder they didn't catch on the initial imaging because it was small enough to miss at the 8-hour mark. The resident was already reaching for the chart. His chest film from 2 hours ago was red as clear. A slow accumulation wouldn't have been obvious yet. She kept her voice even, no accusation in it, because the imaging team had read what was there, and this was the nature of delayed presentations. They revealed themselves on their own timeline, regardless of how carefully anyone looked earlier. We need a chest tube, now. And we need to get his attending on the phone. She talked the resident through the preparation while the attending was paged. Tesler was awake and frightened, the way patients were frightened when they could feel their own breathing changing and didn't understand why. Claire kept her hand on his arm and talked to him the way she'd talked to Jalen, not explaining everything, not minimizing, just maintaining a point of contact so he knew someone was paying attention to him specifically and not just to his numbers. You're going to feel pressure, she told him, then relief. The breathing will get easier. What's wrong? He asked. His voice was strained. There's some fluid that built up during the day. We're going to drain it. Is it bad? She looked at him directly. It was going to be bad if we hadn't caught it. We caught it. The attending arrived 4 minutes later. The chest tube went in. The fluid drained. Tesler's oxygen saturation climbed steadily, and his breathing eased, and the frightened look in his eyes shifted into something exhausted and relieved. The attending, a hospitalist named Dr. Farrow, who'd been managing the Halcott admissions all day, stood at the bedside after and looked at Claire. How did you catch this? He asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question. His respiratory pattern had been drifting subtly for the last 90 minutes. Small changes that were each within normal variance but together indicated a directional change. She was already stripping her gloves. I should have flagged it earlier. You just saved him from a critical deterioration. I caught what I should have caught an hour ago, she said. Earlier would have been better. She wasn't being falsely modest. It was simply true. She'd noticed the drift and deprioritized it because Tesler had been stable overall, and there were other patients with more acute needs. The decision had been defensible. It also could have gone worse than it did. Both things were true simultaneously, and she didn't see any value in pretending otherwise. She was washing her hands in the corridor sink when she heard the voices from the administrative wing. Not normal end-of-day voices. These were louder, not shouting, but the kind of elevated exchange that happened when a professional conversation had stopped being professional. She recognized one voice immediately. Warren Colt, the CEO. She hadn't seen him today. She'd been on the floor all day, and whatever had been happening with the federal investigators had been happening one floor up and behind closed doors. But she knew his voice from the 2 times in 6 weeks she'd been in his presence during all staff meetings. The practiced authority of a man who'd run this institution for 9 years and had never, until today, had any serious reason to believe that wouldn't continue. The second voice was Will's. Measured, deliberate, the interrogative patience of someone who had everything they needed and was simply waiting for the other person to understand that. A door opened down the corridor and then closed again, and the voices cut off. 30 seconds later, Patricia appeared at her shoulder. Colt just tried to pull the financial record server offline, she said, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information and withholding editorial comment. IT stopped it. Apparently the investigators had already flagged the server for preservation. He told IT he was performing routine maintenance. A pause. In the middle of a federal investigation. Claire dried her hands. Where is he now? Still in his office, with 2 federal agents who are not leaving. Patricia hesitated. There's something else. Fitch left the building about 20 minutes ago. His attorney said the interview was concluded. Claire looked at her. He's not under arrest, Patricia said. They let him go. Claire thought about the photograph she'd sent to Wills, the timestamp alteration, the placement coordinator's text. She thought about Wills's face when he'd seen them and what he'd said about Fitch's cooperation agreement not being finalized. Where did he go? She asked. I don't know. He took his personal vehicle from the parking structure. A pause. One of the ER clerks saw him on his phone in the parking lot before he left. She said he looked... Patricia paused again, choosing the word carefully. Panicked. She said he looked like a man who'd just realized something had changed. Something had changed. The photographs had changed it, and Fitch or his attorney had probably been told, and now Fitch was in a car somewhere in Caldwell Ridge with a phone and a calculating mind. And the knowledge that his cooperation agreement was not what he'd thought it was an hour ago. Claire thought about what a man in that position might do. She thought about who else was connected to Harlow Vance, who else in this hospital had something to lose, who might receive a call from Fitch right now, and what that call might prompt. She was reaching for her phone to call Wills when the lights in the corridor flickered. Once, twice. Then the power went out. Not all of it. The emergency generators kicked in within 4 seconds, the standard backup protocol, and the critical systems came back up immediately. Ventilators, cardiac monitors, the OR. But the main overhead lighting stayed down, and in the sudden shift to emergency illumination, the corridor went from bright to a dim amber that made everything look like the inside of something that had already ended. From the administrative wing came the sound of someone running. Not a medical emergency run, different cadence, harder, purposeful. The sound of someone who needed to reach something before someone else did. Then, cutting across everything, the fire alarm. Not a localized alert. The full building system, panels across every floor, the particular mechanical scream that meant either a fire or someone who wanted the building evacuated. Or both. Claire was already moving toward the patient bays before the second alarm cycle, pulling curtains closed, checking equipment batteries, prioritizing. Around her, the floor erupted into controlled emergency response. Nurses moving patients away from windows, residents grabbing crash kits, the charge desk getting on the phone with security, and the fire department simultaneously. Patricia was at the center of it, already managing, already directing traffic, with the authority of someone who'd done mass casualty management today and had not, apparently, run out of the capacity for crises. Bay assignments for non-ambulatory patients, she called. Anderson, Bay 2 and 3. Lewis, 4 and 5. Devlin, 6, 7, and the corridor overflow, Claire said, already moving. She went through the bays systematically. Roy Tesler in Bay 2, stable now, breathing easier. The chest tube in place but manageable for a short evacuation if it came to that. Jalen's bay was empty. His mother had taken him for imaging an hour ago. Margaret Hollis was gone to cardiac monitoring on the second floor. The corridor overflow was 3 patients on gurneys waiting for floor assignments, a concussion from the Halcott site, a burn patient in stable condition, and an elderly woman who'd come in through standard ER intake and had been waiting through the chaos for a bed. The elderly woman's name, according to her wristband, was Frances Adler, and she was 81 years old, and she was sitting up on her gurney watching the alarm lights with an expression of calm interest that Claire found unexpectedly reassuring. "Is this normal?" Frances asked. "No," Claire said, "but we've got it." "That's what my late husband used to say." Frances looked at her. "He was usually wrong." "So am I sometimes," Claire said. "Hold on to the gurney rail." She had all 3 corridor patients repositioned within 4 minutes, moved away from the windows and toward the internal wall, away from the stairwell access that was now sounding with footsteps from multiple floors of staff managing the alarm response. The fire department arrived at 6 minutes, fast, because they'd apparently already been on elevated alert after the Halcott explosion, and swept the building starting from the basement. The alarm had originated on the 3rd floor, near the administrative wing's server room. The server room. Claire stood in the amber-lit corridor and looked at the ceiling for a moment and thought about Warren Colt, who had tried to pull the server offline 40 minutes ago and had been stopped by investigators. She thought about who else had access to the administrative floor. She thought about the sound of running she'd heard before the alarm. Her phone buzzed. Wills. "Where are you?" he asked. "Trauma floor. Corridor B." "Stay there." His voice was tighter than it had been all day. "We have a situation on 3. "I know, the server room." A brief pause. "How do you know?" "Because Colt tried to pull it offline earlier and couldn't, and Fitch left the building 20 minutes ago looking panicked." She moved toward the stairwell door, then stopped herself because she was the responsible party for 3 patients in this corridor, and moving away from them was not an option. "Was there an actual fire?" "Small one, contained already. Looks like an accelerant was introduced to the server hardware." His voice dropped. "They were trying to destroy the financial records backup." "Did they succeed?" "No. We mirrored the server at 1400 hours before any of this started. Everything is on our equipment." A pause. "But someone in this building made this call, and it wasn't Colt. He's been in his office with 2 agents for the last 3 hours." Claire processed that. "You said Fitch left," she said. "Yes, but Fitch left the building. He couldn't have—" Wills stopped. She could hear him doing the same calculation she was doing. His keycard. If he gave his keycard to someone still inside, his admin access would work on the 3rd-floor server room, Claire said. He had consulting privileges that included administrative system access. "It's in the paperwork you served him on." The line was quiet for 3 seconds. "I need to go," Wills said. The call ended. Frances Adler was looking at her from the gurney with the particular attentiveness of an 81-year-old woman who had seen enough of the world to know when someone nearby was holding more information than they were sharing. "You look like someone who's done this before," Frances said. "Which part?" Claire asked. "All of it." She adjusted her position on the gurney with the careful deliberateness of someone managing significant arthritis. "My late husband was a federal marshal for 30 years. I know what someone looks like when they're in the middle of something that hasn't finished yet." Claire looked at her. "He used to come home like that," Frances continued. "That particular kind of quiet. Not calm, quiet. There's a difference." "There is," Claire agreed. The alarm cut off at 7 minutes and 12 seconds. In the sudden absence of it, the building felt different, hollowed out, the way spaces feel when a persistent sound is removed. The emergency lighting stayed on while building systems were verified, and the floor began the process of returning to its operational baseline. Claire was checking Roy Tesler's chest tube drainage when the stairwell door opened and 2 FBI agents came onto the floor moving fast, followed by Garrett Wills, and behind Wills, in the custody of a uniformed officer who was holding his arm, was Dr. Gordon Price. Price was the hospital's director of clinical operations. She'd seen him twice in 6 weeks, once in an all-staff meeting, once passing in the corridor. Mid-40s, quiet, the kind of administrator who was visible enough to appear normal and forgettable enough to avoid scrutiny. She'd had no specific reason to notice him. Apparently she should have. Wills caught her eye across the floor as they moved toward the exit. He gave her a slight nod that meant, "This is the one. This is who made the call," from inside the building. Price was not looking at her. He was looking at the floor in front of his feet with the expression of someone who had made a decision in the last 90 minutes that had permanently altered the direction of his life, and was only now fully understanding that. The stairwell door closed behind them. Patricia appeared at Claire's shoulder. "Was that Price?" "Yes." "What did he do?" "He tried to burn the evidence," Claire said. "Didn't work." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Fitch's keycard?" "That's what they'll establish." "So Fitch called him, after the interview." Patricia's voice was careful. "Fitch knew his deal was falling apart, so he called someone inside and told them to destroy the records before the forensic review got to whatever connects them both to the veterans' billing fraud." Claire moved back to Tesler's chart. "That's what I think." "And now Fitch is in a car somewhere." Claire documented the drainage output, noted the timestamp, closed the chart. "Which is a problem." It was a problem because a man who'd spent the last 3 hours negotiating a cooperation agreement that had just collapsed, who had called someone to commit evidence tampering, who knew that the photographs Claire had sent had changed the shape of what he was facing. That man in a car with a phone was a specific and particular kind of problem. She was at the nursing station when her phone rang for the third time that evening. It was a number she didn't recognize. Local area code. She answered it. The voice was Fitch's. Devlin. He sounded different than he'd sounded on the floor that morning. The performance was entirely gone, the surgical authority stripped away, and what was underneath was something older and smaller. I need you to listen to me. I'm listening, she said. What I did this morning, firing you, that was wrong, clinically and otherwise. I want you to know that. A pause. She could hear road noise behind him. He was still in the car. And Pryor, if there were consequences to my decision on Pryor's case, there almost were, she said. He survived. A silence. I'm going to tell them everything, Fitch said. The full picture. Not what I gave them in the interview, the actual everything. Harlow Vance, the placement operation, what they asked me to do with personnel management, all of it. I'm going to call my attorney and I'm going to tell them everything. Claire kept her voice level. Then call your attorney. I need to know. He stopped. I need to know if that matters. If it changes anything. She looked at the nursing station. At Patricia reviewing the requisition order. At the amber emergency lighting still casting its pale wash across the corridor. At Frances Adler on her gurney, watching her from 30 feet away with the attentive calm of someone's late husband's wife. Dr. Fitch, she said, I'm a nurse. I don't determine what matters to a federal investigation. Call your attorney. Devlin, call your attorney, she said again. And don't call this number again. She ended the call. For a moment, she just stood there with the phone in her hand, and the floor moved around her, and somewhere on the third floor there were investigators working through the aftermath of a fire that hadn't destroyed what it was meant to destroy, and somewhere in this building, Warren Colt was sitting with 2 agents and whatever remained of a 9-year operation that had just ended. And somewhere in Virginia, a woman named Dana Hartwell was sitting with 11 months of a decision she'd made about what kind of person she was going to be. And somewhere in a car in Caldwell Ridge, Wyoming, Roland Fitch was calling his attorney with the full picture, or he wasn't, and that was his decision to make and his consequences to face. Claire's pager went off. She looked at it. Not a patient code. An administrative page, her name, and an extension she didn't recognize, and the notation that made her stand very still for a moment before she read it again to make sure she'd read it correctly. The notation said, Senate Oversight Committee. Secure line. Please call immediately. She looked at the extension number. She looked at the trauma floor around her, the patients, the staff, the amber light, the particular controlled exhaustion of a unit that had done something extraordinary today and was still standing. Then she went to find a phone with a secure connection, because whatever was waiting on the other end of that line had the potential to change things in a way that went far beyond this building, this city, and the people whose names she'd learned today. And she already knew, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent 6 weeks being told she didn't understand how things worked, that she was going to tell them everything. The secure line was in the hospital's administrative communications room on the 2nd floor, a small windowless space with 2 landline phones and a scrambler unit that the federal investigators had apparently commandeered within an hour of their arrival and had left available for exactly this kind of call. Wills met her at the door. You got the page, he said. Who's on the line? Staff Counsel for the Senate Armed Services Committee, Subcommittee on Defense Contracting Oversight. He held the door open. They've been monitoring the Harlow Vance investigation from the congressional side for 7 months. They found out about today's action through DoD channels about 3 hours ago. He paused. They want a first-hand account. From you specifically. Why me specifically? Because you're the through line, he said. You're the person who was at the procurement inspection, who was separated, who ended up placed in a hospital connected to the same network, who then flagged evidence today that broke open the cooperation agreement. He looked at her steadily. To the committee, you're not a witness. You're the narrative. Claire looked at the phone on the table. Who else have they talked to? Hartwell, earlier today. Okafor's office. Our team lead. He paused. You're last. She went in and sat down and picked up the phone. The voice on the other end was female, precise, with the particular cadence of someone who spent their professional life in rooms where words had consequences. A Senate counsel, mid-40s by the sound of it, the kind of practice neutral that wasn't coldness, but was professionalism, so refined, it resembled coldness. Ms. Devlin, thank you for taking this call. I know it's been an extraordinary day. It has, Claire said. I'll be direct. Senator Walcott's subcommittee has been building a case around Harlow Vance Group's defense contracting practices for 7 months. What your IG investigation developed today gives us the civilian side connection we've been missing. Specifically, the hospital billing fraud involving veterans' claims links the contractor network to a pattern of Medicare and TRICARE violations that spans at least 9 facilities across 4 states. Claire was quiet for a moment. 9 facilities. That we've confirmed, possibly more. A brief pause. We want to understand the placement operation, the mechanism by which military medical personnel were directed towards specific facilities. We believe that operations served 2 purposes. First, to seed the billing fraud with credentialed staff who could sign off on procedures, and second, to monitor and manage anyone with direct knowledge of the procurement violations at the base level. They needed people who wouldn't ask questions, Claire said, or who they could remove if they did. Yes, and they needed people with military credentials specifically because TRICARE billing requires military medical designations for certain procedure codes. The council's voice remained even. You were placed at Harrow Peak within 3 weeks of your separation. The speed of that placement, given the involvement of the subsidiary placement service, suggests it was coordinated. Wills told me that today. What Wills may not have told you is what we found in Harlow Vance's internal communications this afternoon. Our investigators executed a warrant on their government relations office in Washington simultaneously with the hospital action here. A pause. There is a document, an internal memo from approximately 16 months ago. It references your inspection findings at Keller Forward Base and describes, in explicit terms, the decision to, quote, relocate the asset to a manageable environment. The asset. 16 months ago, she had been a decorated Army major with 6 years of operational service and a record that anyone in military medicine would have recognized. In a memo from a defense contractor's government relations office, she had been an asset to be relocated. She kept her voice level. I'd like to see that document. You will. It's part of the formal evidentiary package that will be shared with your legal representation. I'm mentioning it now because it establishes something important for the committee's purposes. The council paused. It establishes that what was done to you was not incidental. It was operational, and that distinction matters enormously for what happens next. What happens next? Claire asked. The subcommittee will hold hearings, probably within 60 days, given the pace of the current disclosure. We'll be requesting testimony from multiple parties, including you. Another pause. This is voluntary at this stage, but I want you to understand that your account, the inspection, the separation, the placement, today, is central to what we're building. Claire looked at the wall of the communications room. It was a beige wall with nothing on it and a small ventilation grill in the upper right corner. She focused on the grill for a moment because sometimes the most ordinary things were the most useful ones to focus on. I'll testify, she said. We hoped you would. The first trace of something other than professional neutrality entered the council's voice. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. For what it's worth, Ms. Devlin, and I say this as a statement of fact rather than a compliment, the documentation trail you created during your 6 weeks at Harrow Peak is exceptional. The photographs of the altered records, the preserved text message, the personal notes with timestamps. Without those, today's cooperation agreement process would have been significantly more complicated. I documented because it was the right protocol, Claire said, not because I knew what I was documenting toward. I know, that's exactly why it holds up. The call lasted another 14 minutes. Claire answered every question with the same precision she'd brought to every chart notation and every supply count, specific, sequential, without editorializing. When the council asked her to walk through the inspection findings at Keller Forward Base, she did, from memory, in the order they'd occurred. When the council asked about her separation proceedings, she described what she'd seen in the documents presented to her and what she'd understood to be false about them, and why. When the call ended, she sat in the communications room for a moment before standing. Wills was in the corridor. How was it? He asked. Efficient, she said, and moved past him toward the stairwell. The trauma floor at 9 o'clock on a mass casualty day looked like the aftermath of a sustained operation. Not destroyed, but used hard, every surface and person carrying the evidence of what had passed through. The day shift staff were mostly gone, handing off to the night team who were receiving the most complicated shift change report in recent institutional memory. Claire gave her own report to the night charge nurse, a man named Gary Portillo, who had the face of someone who'd heard the broad strokes from multiple sources and was now trying to reconcile them into a working picture. And she did it the same way she did everything, systematically, without editorializing, prioritized by clinical relevance. Roy Tesler, Bay 2, chest tube in place, drainage within acceptable parameters, monitor for signs of reaccumulation, surgical follow-up confirmed for 7 a.m. Jalen, Bay 7, returned from imaging, burn wound dressed and documented, pain managed, minor anxiety noted, mother present and informed. The 3 corridor overflow patients, all assigned to floors, transferred and handed to floor nursing teams. Margaret Hollis, stable in cardiac monitoring on 2, procedure scheduled. She was done with the report in 11 minutes. Portillo had good instincts. He asked the right follow-up questions and didn't ask unnecessary ones, and by the end he had a working picture that he could manage. She was collecting in her bag from the locker room when Patricia Ogden found her. Patricia leaned in the doorway in the particular way of someone who has something to say and hasn't yet decided how directly to say it. "Night team's solid," Claire said, not looking up from her bag. "Portillo knows what he's got." "I know," Patricia said. "That's not—" She stopped. Tried again. "The administrator called down an hour ago. The interim administrator, I mean, since Colt is currently unavailable. I'm aware of Colt's current situation. She asked me to let you know that your formal reinstatement paperwork is being prepared. Full nursing privileges, effective tomorrow." Patricia paused. "She also asked me to ask if you'd be willing to take on a shift leadership role while the floor stabilizes through all of this." Claire zipped her bag. "Tell her I'll think about it." She also said, Patricia stopped again, in the same way she'd stopped before. The way people stopped when they were trying to say something they didn't have the right language for. She said she was sorry for this morning. Claire looked at her. "The interim administrator was in payroll this morning," Patricia said. "She wasn't involved in any of it, but she said she was sorry it happened in this building." "Okay," Claire said. She picked up her bag. "Tell her I'll be in at 7. She drove home in the dark, through Caldwell Ridges downtown, and out along the Eastern Highway toward the small rental house she'd lived in for 6 weeks, without acquiring anything beyond the furniture that had been there when she arrived. She'd made a habit, since her separation, of not acquiring things, not out of conscious discipline, but because acquisition implied permanence, and permanence had not felt available to her for 14 months. She sat in the driveway for a moment after the engine cut off, in the particular quiet of a car that has stopped moving, and let herself do something she hadn't done all day, which was feel the actual weight of it. Not the investigation, not the restoration, not Harlow Vance or Dre or Hartwell or the Senate subcommittee. Just the weight of 14 months of carrying a version of events she couldn't share with anyone. A record that said she was something she knew she wasn't. A separation that had told her at a very fundamental level that the institution she'd given 6 years to had decided she was disposable. She sat with that weight for about 4 minutes. Then she went inside, ate the leftover soup she'd made 2 days ago, and heated on the stove, and went to bed. She slept better than she had in 14 months, which she hadn't expected, and woke at 5:30 without an alarm, which was normal. The next 3 days moved with the particular velocity of institutional consequence in motion, fast and grinding simultaneously, the gears of legal and administrative process turning with a friction that created heat without immediately producing visible results. Claire worked her shifts. She answered questions from federal investigators in the evenings, formally, with the legal representation that the IG's office had connected her with. A civilian attorney named Marsh who was competent and efficient and didn't try to be her friend, which she appreciated. Fitch had called his attorney from the car, as he'd said he would, and had arranged a second formal interview for the following morning. He had given them the full picture, or what he characterized as the full picture, and the full picture was considerably more detailed than his first account. He confirmed the Harlow Vance consulting structure across 6 physicians at 3 facilities. He confirmed the Personnel Management Directive, a standing instruction to identify and remove staff with military medical credentials who showed signs of examining billing practices too closely. He confirmed that he'd been told, through an intermediary, that Claire Devlin was specifically flagged as a high-priority removal when she was placed at Harrow Peak. He confirmed that he had known who she was before she arrived. The cooperation agreement, significantly modified from its original form, was renegotiated over 36 hours of back and forth between Fitch's attorney and the federal prosecutors. What Fitch received in exchange for full cooperation was a reduction in criminal exposure, not an elimination of it. His medical license was subject to immediate review by the state medical board, independent of the federal proceedings. The board convened on the third day and issued an emergency suspension of his surgical privileges pending the completion of their investigation. The suspension was public record. Claire learned about it from Patricia, who had learned about it from the overnight charge nurse, who had seen it posted on the medical board's public notification system at 6 a.m. She was in the middle of a chest wound assessment when Patricia told her, and she said, "Okay," and finished the assessment, because the patient in front of her was what was in front of her. Warren Colt had been arrested on the second day on charges of obstruction of justice for the server room incident and healthcare fraud. The arrest was also public record, and it produced a particular effect on the hospital's atmosphere that Claire observed without contributing to. A slow, collective recalibration among staff who had worked for years in an institution whose leadership had been, it turned out, something other than what it appeared. Gordon Price, the clinical operations director who had introduced the accelerant to the server hardware, had been charged with obstruction and destruction of evidence. His attorney was making arguments about duress, that Price had acted under pressure from Fitch, and those arguments were going to be the subject of considerable legal argument over the coming months. In Washington and in Virginia, and at a military installation in Texas that Claire had never been to, other consequences were moving at their own pace. Colonel Marcus Dray had retained a military defense attorney. 2 other officers connected to the Keller Forward Base inspection had been placed on administrative leave pending formal proceedings. The Harlow Vance Group's government contracts, 6 active contracts across 3 branches of service, had been frozen pending review by the DoD Inspector General's office. The memo that called Claire the asset to be relocated had been entered into the evidentiary record. She learned about that from Marsh, her attorney, on the evening of the third day, in a phone call that lasted 22 minutes and covered the formal status of her military record restoration, the projected timeline for the expungement to be finalized, and the structure of what she'd be asked to provide for the Senate subcommittee. The IG's formal recommendation went to the Secretary's office this afternoon, Marsh told her. The language is unambiguous. Your separation was procedurally void. Your rank was never legitimately revoked. The formal documentation will take approximately 3 weeks to process through the administrative channels, but the legal effect is retroactive. Meaning? Meaning for legal purposes. You have been a major in the United States Army for the last 14 months. You simply didn't know it. A brief pause. Your back pay, I'll deal with the back pay later, she said. There's also the matter of the retirement credit for the 14 months. It accumulates later, she said. Is there anything that requires my immediate action? No, the process is moving. I'll notify you at each stage. She thanked him and hung up. On the 4th day, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. She was in the break room at noon, eating a sandwich standing at the counter because she hadn't had time to sit down, when the door opened and Dennis Pryor's wife came in. The woman was in her late 30s, dark-haired, wearing a jacket over a Halcott processing shirt, which meant she'd come from the facility where her husband worked, or had been at the hospital long enough that she was wearing what she'd arrived in 3 days ago. She stopped in the doorway when she saw Claire, and then came in anyway, because whatever she'd come to say, she'd apparently decided to say. "You're Devlin," she said. "The nurse." "Yes." "Dennis is going to be okay." She said it like she'd practiced it, like she'd gone over the exact words. The surgeon told me that it was flagged early enough to make a difference, that if it hadn't been caught when it was... She stopped. "He said you flagged it, before everything that happened with you that day." Claire set down her sandwich. "I'm glad he's doing well." "He doesn't know yet. About everything, the hospital, the investigation. He's been recovering. I haven't told him the whole thing." She looked at Claire steadily. "But I know. I read what was in the paper. I know you were fired the same morning. I know why." A pause. I needed to come and say that he's okay, and that I know what you did." Claire looked at her for a moment. I documented what I observed. That's the job. He has 3 kids, the woman said. Under 10. I needed you to know that. She left without waiting for a response, and Claire ate the rest of her sandwich standing at the counter, and she did not cry, partly because she was at work and partly because the thing she felt wasn't quite grief or relief or gratitude. It was something more complicated than any of those, something that had to do with the specific weight of knowing that a thing you did on a morning when everything was going wrong had mattered in a way you couldn't see at the time. She went back to the floor. On the 5th day, the news cycle found the story. Not locally, Caldwell Ridge's local paper had been running it since day one, but nationally, a defense contracting network, a hospital billing fraud, a military whistleblower whose forced separation had been documented in an internal memo as operational, a Senate subcommittee investigation, 9 facilities across 4 states. It was the kind of story that moved because it had everything: institutional corruption, a human face, a paper trail, and consequences that were visibly in motion. Claire's name appeared in the first national story, attributed to federal court documents, which were public record. She didn't speak to the press. Marsh had advised against it, and she'd agreed immediately, but her name was there, and her rank, and the phrase Army Major forced out to protect defense contractor fraud, which was reductive but not inaccurate. The hospital's phones ran hot for 2 days. The interim administrator issued a statement. The Army issued a statement. Senator Walcott's office issued a statement. Claire worked her shifts. On the 6th morning, she arrived at 7 to find Garrett Wills in the corridor outside the main entrance. He was in the same dark jacket he'd worn the day they met, or possibly a different one that was identical, and he had 2 coffees in paper cups and held one out when he saw her coming. She took it. "Dre," he said, without preamble. "He's accepted a plea arrangement. Court-martial proceedings are being converted to a formal administrative process. He'll be stripped of rank and benefits." He paused. "Not criminal confinement. There wasn't enough on the direct fraud to get there. He was the implementer, not the architect. His attorney negotiated the parameters." Claire drank her coffee. It was better than the hospital break room coffee, which wasn't a high bar. "And the architect?" "Harlow Vance's VP of Government Relations, man named Stonebridge. He's been in a federal facility in Denver since day 2. His attorneys are fighting extradition on a separate civil matter, which is going to complicate the timeline, but the DOJ is confident on the primary charges." He paused. "Wire fraud, bribery, obstruction, and a conspiracy count that covers the Personnel Management Directive." He let that settle. "The memo with your name on it is the anchor of that conspiracy count." "Good," she said. "There's something else." Wills turned his coffee cup in his hands, which was the first time she'd seen him do anything that looked like discomfort. "The placement service. The subsidiary." He looked at her. "We finished mapping it." She waited. 17 facilities, he said, across 7 states. Not all of them had active billing fraud. Some were staging points, places where flagged military personnel were placed and monitored without being actively used in the scheme. Some were more deeply involved. He paused. Harrow Peak was one of the more deeply involved. 17 facilities, 9 she'd been told about by the Senate Council. The full number was 17. "How many personnel were placed through the subsidiary?" she asked. 31 that we've confirmed, probably more that we haven't matched yet." He looked at her steadily. Of those 31, 11 filed complaints or flagged billing irregularities during their placement period. All 11 were removed from their facilities. Most were removed through manufactured misconduct proceedings similar to yours. He paused. 2 resigned before the proceedings were initiated. They apparently read the situation early and got out. The remaining 9, including you, have records that are now the subject of individual IG reviews. 9 people. 9 separation records built on fabricated documentation, filtered through a network that had been operational for at least 4 years, all of them created to silence people who'd seen something they weren't supposed to see. Claire finished her coffee. She looked at the entrance to Harrow Peak Medical Center, the doors she'd been walked out of 6 days ago with someone else's hands on her badge. "Are you going to be okay?" Wills asked. It was the first personal question he'd asked her since they'd met. She looked at him. "I'm fine," she said. "I know you're fine. That's not what I asked." She considered that for a moment. It was a distinction that 6 days ago she would have deflected without engaging. She wasn't sure why she didn't deflect it now. "I'll let you know when I figure it out," she said. He nodded once, like that was an acceptable answer. He collected both empty cups and walked toward the parking structure, and Claire went through the entrance doors and back to work. The shift was a standard day: a broken arm, a cardiac monitoring case, 3 flu presentations that should have been managed by a primary care physician, a woman in her early 30s with abdominal pain that turned out to be appendicitis, and a ranch hand who'd fallen off a fence at 6 in the morning and broken 2 ribs. Normal work. The kind of day that reminded her why she'd become a nurse before she'd become anything the Army subsequently made her. She was finishing the rib fracture patient's discharge paperwork at 4 in the afternoon when the call came through to the nursing station. Not her cell phone, the station line. Patricia took it, listened for a moment, and then walked over to Claire with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "It's for you," Patricia said. "Army Liaison Office. They said they need to speak to you before close of business today about—" Patricia paused, checking the note she'd written. "About a matter involving your formal reinstatement and an attached proposal." "A proposal," Claire repeated. "That's what they said. They used the word proposal." Patricia handed over the note. "They have a secure line." Claire looked at the note. She looked at the trauma board. The broken arm patient was discharged. The appendicitis was in surgical prep. The cardiac case was stable. The flu presentations were gone. The ranch hand was going home with instructions to rest and an appointment with his GP. The board was, for the first time in 6 days, almost clear. She took the note and went to find a phone. The Army liaison officer was a woman, efficient, military precise, reading from a document that Claire could hear the formal structure of even through the phone. "As part of the formal reinstatement process, Major Devlin, the Army Medical Department is extending an attached proposal for your consideration. The proposal involves an advisory and training role within the 44th Medical Brigade's Trauma Preparedness Program. Specifically, curriculum development for field medic training and civilian military coordination protocols. The role is civilian contracted, not a return to active service, unless you choose to pursue that separately through the standard commission process." A pause. "This is not a requirement. It's an offer, extended in recognition of your expertise and your service record." Claire listened to the full description. It was a real role, substantive, not ceremonial. The kind of work that would have mattered to her 6 years ago, and she found still did. "I'll consider it," she said. "Of course. We ask for a response within 30 days. Another pause. "There's one additional item on the call. General Okafor asked me to convey personally that the formal reinstatement ceremony, if you choose to have one, can be scheduled at your convenience and at a location of your choosing. He said—" The liaison paused slightly, suggesting she was reading something off script now. "He said, you've earned the right to choose the room." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Tell General Okafor I appreciate that," she said. "I'll be in touch." She hung up. She stood in the communications room for a moment, the same small room where she'd taken the Senate Council's call 6 days ago, the same beige wall, the same ventilation grill in the upper corner. She thought about 31 people, 17 facilities, 9 records under review. She thought about the curriculum for a trauma preparedness program and the specific things she knew about field medicine that were not in any existing training module, and the gap between what medics were taught in controlled environments and what they actually needed when the controlled environment ceased to exist. She thought about Harrow Peak's trauma floor and the residents who'd been working alongside her for 6 days now with a different quality of attention than they'd had before. The particular sharpening that came from working beside someone who raised the standard not by demanding it, but by operating at it consistently. She thought about Patricia Ogden, who had put her name on a chart notation for a patient she could have left undocumented. She thought about Francis Adler on a gurney in amber-lit chaos, saying, "He used to come home like that." That particular kind of quiet. She went back to the floor. At 5:45, 15 minutes before her shift ended, the double doors from the main corridor opened and 2 people came through who didn't belong in a hospital in any clinical capacity. The first was a man in his mid-30s wearing the particular casual clothes of someone who worked in a federal building and had removed his jacket. Lanyard still around his neck, ID badge turned backward. The second was a woman Claire's age, early 40s, in a suit carrying a tablet. They walked to the nursing station and spoke to Patricia. Patricia looked up and found Claire across the floor. The expression on Patricia's face was careful, controlled, with something moving under it that Claire couldn't immediately categorize. Claire crossed the floor. The man with the lanyard turned out to be a paralegal from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The woman was the assistant U.S. attorney managing the criminal case. Her name was Villard, compact and direct, the kind of person who moved through rooms without wasting energy. "Major Devlin," Villard said, "we need about 5 minutes." They went to the break room. Villard's paralegal stood near the door, tablet ready. "We've been reviewing the documentation from Fitch's second interview," Villard said, without preamble. "He's been cooperative and his account has been consistent across 3 separate sessions. We're confident he's giving us everything." She paused. "But there's a complication." "What kind?" "Fitch identified an additional layer in the Harlow-Vance structure that wasn't in our original investigation. Specifically, an internal review committee within the contractor's medical division that approved the personnel management directives. The committee had 5 members. We've identified 4 of them through existing documentation." She set her tablet on the table and turned it to face Claire. "The 5th member is identified in internal documents only by a designation. Harlow-Vance used role titles instead of names for the committee. The designation is Medical Oversight Coordinator." She looked at Claire. "Fitch knew this person. He interacted with them directly, but he only knew them by phone and by the role designation. He never had a name, a face, or a physical description." Claire looked at the tablet. The document on the screen was a redacted internal Harlow-Vance memo, the role designation highlighted in yellow. "You need to identify the 5th member," she said. "We need to identify the 5th member," Villard confirmed, "because they were the person who approved the specific directives affecting your placement and your subsequent personnel management." She paused. "Fitch says the coordinator knew the details of your military case at a level that suggests direct involvement in the original separation proceedings. Not just awareness, involvement." Claire looked at the highlighted designation. She thought about the chain, Dre, who had implemented, the Harlow-Vance executives who had architected, and somewhere in the structure, a 5th person who had known enough about her specific case to direct the placement with the precision that had put her in a Harlow-Vance-connected facility within 3 weeks of her separation. "What do you have?" she asked. "Phone records from the Harlow-Vance Medical Division, Fitch's call log going back 4 years. Villard reached across and scrolled the tablet. "The coordinator always called from a number registered to a communications LLC, Standard Operational Security. The LLC has a registered agent, and the registered agent has a name, and we've been running down the name for 48 hours. She paused. "The registered agent is a lawyer in Virginia. Very clean, no direct criminal exposure, just administrative connections. But the registered agent's client list includes 3 individuals connected to your original court-martial proceedings." 3 individuals connected to the court-martial. "One of them," Velarde said, "is Dana Hartwell." The break room was very small and very quiet. Claire looked at Villard without expression. "I know she's the whistleblower," Villard said. "I know she's been cooperating for 11 months. I know what she's provided has been central to this case." She held Claire's gaze. "But her name appearing on a registered agent's client list connected to the coordinator's communication structure means we have a question we need to answer before the case proceeds. And we need to answer it fast, because the coordination is ongoing. The coordinator has not been identified, has not been served, and is potentially still active." Claire thought about the phone call from Hartwell 3 days ago. The timing of it, late in the day, after Okafor's public statement, after Fitch's interview. The precise description of the investigation's timeline, the details that Hartwell had provided that were accurate down to specific dates and procedural steps. She thought about Hartwell saying, "I'm the whistleblower," and how that had landed as confirmation of everything Claire had needed it to confirm. She thought about what Hartwell had not said, what Hartwell had not explained. The 2-week gap between Claire's inspection report and the initiation of the court-martial proceedings. A gap that required someone with specific knowledge of Claire's findings to have communicated them to the right people at the right time. "When was Hartwell's name added to the registered agent's client list?" Claire asked. Villard looked at her paralegal, who checked the tablet. "The LLC was registered 14 months ago. Hartwell's name appears in the client records from the same month." 14 months ago. the same month as Claire's separation. Will's, Claire said. Where is he? En route. He'll be here in... Villard checked her phone. 12 minutes. Does Hartwell know you found this? No, we haven't approached her. We wanted to speak to you first. Claire sat with that. The break room around her was exactly as it always was. The counter, the coffee maker, the table with the uneven leg that people compensated for without noticing. Everything ordinary, everything exactly where it had been this morning when she'd stood at the counter eating her sandwich. The question wasn't whether Hartwell had been connected to the communication structure. Her name was in the records. The question was what the connection meant, whether it was evidence of ongoing participation in the network that had destroyed Claire's career, or evidence of something else entirely, something that fit differently inside the picture they'd built over the last 6 days. The question was whether the woman who'd said, "I'm the whistleblower," had been telling the truth, a partial truth, or something designed to land like the truth without being it. Villard was watching her with the patient attention of someone who understood that the person across the table was processing something important and needed the space to do it. There's one more thing, Villard said quietly. Fitch's call log, the coordinator's number. The last call was placed 48 hours ago, after Fitch's first interview, after the fire. She paused. Someone in this network knows the investigation has reached a critical stage, and they made a call 2 days ago that we haven't been able to fully trace yet. She held Claire's gaze. We think the coordinator is trying to move something before we can get to it. We don't know what. Outside the break room door, the floor sounds continued. The monitors, the footsteps, the ordinary percussion of a hospital managing its patients through an ordinary late afternoon. And somewhere, a phone had rung 2 days ago, and someone had answered it and started moving something that Velarde and Wills and the entire federal apparatus had not yet been able to locate. Claire looked at the door. Tell Wills I'll be in the communications room, she said, and stood up. Wills arrived in 11 minutes, not 12. He came through the communications room door still buttoning his jacket, which was the first time Claire had seen him look anything other than composed, and he sat across from her at the small table and put his phone face up between them and didn't waste time on preamble. You've been briefed on the registered agent connection, he said. Yes. What's your read? She'd spent the 11 minutes thinking about exactly that. Not emotionally, she'd set the emotional dimension aside, the way she'd learned to set things aside when clear thinking was what the situation required, but analytically, working through what she knew against what she'd been told and what the gaps between them suggested. Hartwell called me 3 days ago, Claire said. She described the investigation's timeline in specific detail. She knew the dates of key procedural steps. She knew Dre had been served before it was public. She paused. At the time, I read that as evidence that she was deeply embedded in the whistleblower process. Now I'm reading it differently. She knew because she had access to the information from 2 directions, Wills said. Possibly, yes. Claire looked at the table. Or she knew because she's been managing what the investigation sees from the beginning, feeding enough truth to establish credibility while keeping the 5th seat at the committee table invisible. Wills was quiet for a moment. The documents she provided, they've been verified. The forged signatures, the communication records from the Harlow Vance representative. All of it checks out. I know. That's what makes it complicated. She looked at him. A partial cooperator gives you real evidence that serves 2 purposes. It advances the investigation, and it controls the investigation's direction. If Hartwell has been shaping what the IG's office looks at, she's been doing it by giving them things that are true, but that point away from her. That's a significant accusation. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. Do you believe it? She sat with that for a moment. The honest answer was that she didn't know, and she was experienced enough with the difference between what she believed and what she could support to keep those categories separate. I believe her name is on that client list for a reason, she said. And I believe the timing, 14 months ago, the same month as my separation, is not coincidental. And I believe that someone who spent 2 weeks watching what happened to me and said nothing, and then spent 11 months feeding information to an investigation, is someone who has been making calculations about her own position the entire time. She paused. Whether those calculations include active participation in the network or just proximity to it, I can't tell you, but I think you need to find out before she knows you're looking. Wills picked up his phone. We're already moving on it. The LLC's financial records are being subpoenaed tonight. The call that was made 48 hours ago, we've got a cell tower triangulation that puts the originating device in the Northern Virginia area. Hartwell is in Northern Virginia. Lots of people are in Northern Virginia. Yes. He looked at her. But not everyone who is in Northern Virginia was at Keller Forward Base during the procurement inspection cycle and has a name on a registered agent list connected to the coordinator's communication structure. He paused. We're not arresting her tonight. We don't have enough for that. What we're doing is putting eyes on the situation and running the financials. What do you need from me? Nothing tonight. Go home. He said it like he meant it, not like a dismissal. You've given us everything you have. The rest of this is our work. She looked at him for a moment. If it's her, she said, not a question, but a threshold she was marking, putting language around something she needed to be clear about. I want to know. Whatever you find, I want to know directly. You'll know, he said. She went home. She didn't sleep as well as she had the night before, which she'd half expected. She lay in the dark and thought about Dana Hartwell's voice on the phone, the catch in it when she'd described seeing the forged signatures, the precision of her account, the way she'd said, I needed you to hear it from me, as if the act of saying it was what mattered most. She thought about what it would mean if the catch in Hartwell's voice had been real. She thought about what it would mean if it hadn't been. She thought about a career built on reading situations under pressure, reading injury patterns, reading system failures, reading the gap between what a chart said and what a patient's body was actually doing, and how that skill did not transfer cleanly to reading the internal life of someone she'd trusted, and then stopped trusting, and then partially trusted again. She fell asleep at 2:30 and woke at 5:15 and went to work. The answer came at 11:40 a.m. on the 8th day, while she was in the corridor outside Bay 4 doing a chart update. Wills called her cell directly. It was her, he said. Claire stopped walking. Not in the way we initially thought, he continued. The financials came back this morning. Hartwell wasn't receiving payment from the coordinator structure. She wasn't directing the placement operation. Her role was narrower than that, which in some ways makes it worse. He paused. She was the information source, specifically the person who provided Harlow Vance with enough detail about your inspection findings and your personality profile to determine that you were, in their assessment, a high-priority removal risk. Claire leaned against the corridor wall. She didn't fabricate the documents, Wills continued. She didn't coordinate the court-martial. She provided a detailed debrief to the Harlow Vance representative after their initial meeting, the one she told you about, the one she described as a conversation she'd walked away from. She didn't walk away. She gave them 30 minutes of detailed information about your findings and your likely next steps. He paused. And then she walked away and told herself she hadn't really done anything. The corridor continued its noise around her. Footsteps, wheels, the distant sound of a monitor alarm being silenced. The call 48 hours ago, Claire said, was to her, from an unregistered device. Someone, probably Stonebridge's people from inside the federal facility, which is going to be its own problem, trying to tell her the fifth seat was close to being identified. He paused. She didn't make any outgoing calls after that. Didn't attempt to move anything. By all appearances, she sat with it for 48 hours and did nothing. She was waiting to see if it came for her, Claire said. That's our read. Is she being charged? Conspiracy to obstruct, for the initial debrief that enabled the fabrication of the court-martial documentation. Her attorney is being contacted today. A pause. She's going to cooperate fully. She's already said so, through her attorney, as of this morning, which suggests she's been expecting this call. Claire looked at the floor. The linoleum had a small scuff mark near the baseboard that she'd walked past every day for a week and a half without registering it. She registered it now. Claire. Wills used her first name, which he hadn't done before. I'm sorry. I know this one is different from the others. She was quiet for a moment. It's not different, she said. It just feels like it is. She hung up and stood in the corridor for 60 seconds, which was what she could afford, and then she went back to work. The formal consequence for Dana Hartwell moved through the legal process over the following weeks, with the grinding momentum that all such processes had, slower than the weight of it deserved, faster than forgiveness would have required. She pled to a single count of conspiracy, negotiated through her attorney with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the agreed recommendation involved no prison term, but a permanent bar from federal service and a formal censure entered into the military record that would follow her name through every future background check and professional reference. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't enough. Claire understood both of those things simultaneously and made a decision early to stop carrying the weight of the gap between them. The gap was real. She couldn't close it. Holding it wasn't going to change its size. She never spoke to Hartwell again. Hartwell's attorney sent a letter, a formal apology, carefully worded, clearly written, with legal review. And Claire read it once and put it in a drawer. Not because it meant nothing, but because meaning something and mattering were different categories, and she'd spent enough of her life letting other people's choices define her interior landscape. The rest of the structure came down in stages, each one public, each one producing the specific institutional satisfaction that comes when accountability catches up to harm at a scale large enough to be visible. Marcus Dre, stripped of rank and benefits, his name entered into the military's formal records of misconduct. 2 active duty officers placed on administrative leave formally separated from service. The Harlow Vance Group's government contracts permanently revoked. The company itself the subject of a DOJ civil action that would take years to resolve but had already produced the suspension of its entire executive leadership. Stonebridge, the VP of Government Relations, whose name had been at the center of the architect's chair, went to trial in federal court in Denver 8 weeks after the day Claire had stood in a supply room counting chest seals. The trial lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. The charges included wire fraud, bribery, obstruction of justice, and the conspiracy count anchored by the memo that had called Claire Devlin an asset to be relocated. He was convicted on all counts. The sentencing was covered by 3 national news outlets. Claire didn't watch the coverage. She heard about the sentence from Marsh, her attorney, in a call that lasted 4 minutes. 12 years, federal facility, no parole eligibility for 7. Marsh delivered it with the professional neutrality of someone who had been in this business long enough not to editorialize, and Claire thanked him and went back to the chart she'd been reviewing. She told herself the sentence was just. She believed that. She also knew that 12 years in a federal facility was a clean, comprehensible consequence, and that the actual harm, 31 people, 17 facilities, careers built on real skill and real dedication, dismantled by people for whom those careers were operational problems to be managed, was not a thing that sentences resolved. It was just a thing that sentences marked. Warren Colt pled guilty to healthcare fraud and obstruction, negotiated to 18 months plus restitution. The restitution figure, when it was published as part of the public court record, was large enough that it produced a brief secondary news cycle. Gordon Price, the clinical operations director who'd set the server room fire, received a federal conviction for destruction of evidence and obstruction, with a 3-year sentence and permanent bar from healthcare administration. Roland Fitch's case resolved last among the Harrow Peak defendants, and it resolved in the way that cases resolve when cooperation purchases currency and currency purchases outcomes that look like justice from a distance and like compromise up close. His medical license was permanently revoked by the state medical board. That much was clean, that much was unambiguous, and the federal charges were reduced through his attorney's negotiation and his sustained cooperation to a single count of conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, with a sentence of probation and a significant financial penalty. No prison time. Claire learned about it on a Thursday afternoon from Patricia, who had seen it in the medical board's public notification system, the same place she'd seen the emergency suspension weeks before. She stood at the nursing station with the information for a moment. "You okay?" Patricia asked. "Yes," Claire said. Patricia looked at her. "His license is gone," Claire said. "He can't touch another patient." She looked at the board. That's the part that mattered most. She meant it. She checked her own reaction against the statement and found that it was true, which surprised her slightly, because she'd expected to feel more than that. More anger, more of the sense that the outcome had fallen short. What she felt instead was something quieter and more durable than anger. Something that had to do with knowing that every patient who would have walked into a room with Roland Fitch and received his particular brand of lethal arrogance would now not receive it. That was not nothing. The reinstatement ceremony took place on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the Stonebridge verdict. Claire had chosen the location, not a military installation, not a formal hall, but the community center in Caldwell Ridge's Veterans District, a low-ceilinged building with folding chairs and fluorescent lights, and a parking lot that flooded when it rained. She'd chosen it because it was the kind of place where people who'd served actually gathered, not the kind of place where their service was commemorated by people who hadn't. General Okafor came himself. He'd offered to send a representative, and Claire had said no. She'd prefer him directly, and he'd said he'd be there without hesitation, which told her something about the kind of officer he was. There were 37 people in the room. Patricia Ogden, who'd driven down from Harrow Peak on her day off. Garrett Wills, who sat in the back row and didn't speak during the ceremony but was there when it ended. The third-year resident who'd been beside her during Margaret Hollis's resuscitation. He'd asked if he could come, and she'd said yes because she'd meant what she said about him having good instincts. Jalen's mother, who had found her through the hospital's public contact form and sent a message asking if she could bring Jalen, and Claire had said, of course. Jalen came in with his arm still in a light protective bandage, the burn healing well, his face carrying the particular mix of awkward and genuine that 17-year-olds carried when they wanted to express something they didn't have comfortable language for yet. Roy Tesler wasn't there. He was still in recovery, progressing well, and his wife had sent a card that Patricia had passed along. Frances Adler wasn't there, but she'd sent a note through the hospital, 3 lines in a very old-fashioned cursive, that said, "My late husband would have liked you. He was right about most things. I think he would have been right about this." Claire had kept the note. Dennis Pryor's wife came with their youngest child, a 4-year-old who spent the ceremony sitting on the floor beside her chair, drawing in a notebook and paying no attention to the proceedings whatsoever, which Claire found unexpectedly comforting. The ceremony itself was brief. Okafor spoke for 8 minutes, not about Claire's history in the broad cinematic terms that public occasions invited, but specifically, precisely, in the manner of someone who had read the file and understood what was in it, and respected the person enough not to flatten them into a symbol. He described the procurement inspection at Keller Forward Base. He described the fabrication of the court-martial documentation. He described, in formal terms, the IG's findings and the conclusion that the separation had been procedurally void from its initiation. He described the restoration of rank, record, and benefits, and the retroactive crediting of 14 months of service that had occurred regardless of whether the Army had been paying attention to it. He did not describe her as extraordinary. He described her as accurate. In her clinical assessments, in her inspection findings, in her personal documentation practices, in her decision to walk back through the doors of a hospital that had just fired her because there were people inside who needed someone who knew what they were doing. He said the word accurate 3 times, and each time it landed with more weight than the more obvious words would have. He pinned the rank insignia himself. Claire stood straight and let him, and she looked at the wall behind him. Not through him, not past him, just at the wall, and she felt the weight of the insignia as a physical thing, which it was, and she felt the weight of the 14 months as a different physical thing, which it also was, and she kept her face even because she was at a ceremony, and that was what ceremonies required. When Okafor stepped back, he held her gaze for a moment. "Welcome back, Major," he said. "Thank you, sir," she said. Then Jalen started clapping from the second row, which he did with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't been briefed on the protocol of military ceremonies and was operating on instinct, which was fine. The rest of the room followed, and the folding chairs and the fluorescent lights, and the parking lot that flooded when it rained filled with the sound of 37 people who had shown up on a Tuesday. She accepted the Army's advisory proposal the following morning, sitting at the kitchen table in her rental house with a cup of coffee and the formal offer letter that Marsh had emailed her. She read it through twice, not because she hadn't already decided, but because she thought an offer that had implications for how she would spend her professional life for the next several years deserved to be read carefully rather than signed in the first 30 seconds of emotional momentum. The role was curriculum development for trauma preparedness, field medic training, civilian military coordination protocols, the specific gap between what people learned in controlled environments and what they actually needed when the controlled environment failed. It was contract work, not a return to active service, which suited her. It meant she could continue working clinical shifts at Harrow Peak, which the interim administrator had made clear she was welcome to do for as long as she wanted. It meant she could build something that would outlast any single facility or posting. It meant the things she knew, the things that had been dismissed as a nursing hunch by a man who was now permanently barred from medicine, would go somewhere useful rather than disappearing with her. She signed the offer letter and sent it back. She worked the afternoon shift that day, which was a standard day. A fracture, 2 respiratory cases, an elderly man with a medication interaction that required careful management, a young woman who'd been in a minor car accident and was fine but frightened, and a 40-year-old man who came in with chest pain and turned out to have been having anxiety attacks for 3 months that he'd been telling himself were indigestion. She managed each case with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. No case was more important because of what the week had been. No patient was a symbol of anything. They were people who needed someone to pay attention to what their bodies were doing, and she paid attention. At 7 p.m., near the end of her shift, a new trauma came through the doors. A construction worker, 40s, fall from scaffolding, possible spinal and multiple fracture injuries. The paramedics calling it in fast and accurate. A good crew who knew what they had. Claire was the first nurse on the gurney. She ran the assessment with the resident beside her. A first year she hadn't worked with much yet, visibly nervous, reaching for her training and finding it. And Claire kept her voice even and direct, naming what she was doing and why. Not to teach, but because narrating the process out loud was useful under pressure and happened to function as teaching simultaneously. The patient was conscious and in significant pain, and his name was Marcus, he told her, when she asked, Marcus Odin, and he had a wife and the wife had been called. Marcus, she said, her hand on his uninjured arm. We've got you. Can you feel your feet? He concentrated. Yeah, I can. Good. That's good. She looked at the resident. See spine precautions, imaging priority, and get ortho on the phone now. The resident moved. The trauma floor opened up around her, bays, monitors, the coordinated noise of people doing things that mattered. And she was inside it, the way she'd been inside it her whole adult life in one form or another, and she worked. Later, after Marcus Odin was in imaging and the resident had gotten through the initial crisis phase and found something resembling his footing, Claire stood at the nursing station writing her notes and thought about what she would say if she were ever asked. By the Senate subcommittee, by a reporter, by someone in a trauma preparedness training session who wanted to know what she'd learned from any of this. What the thing was, the actual thing, underneath all of it. She thought she would say this, that the system had told her she was wrong and she had believed the system enough to leave. And then she had walked back in anyway because there were people who needed someone who knew what they were doing, and the choice to walk back in had nothing to do with the system's opinion of her and everything to do with what she actually knew. That was the thing people got confused about. They thought that being dismissed, being told you don't belong here, your judgment doesn't count, your record doesn't support your presence in this room, was an argument about who you were. It wasn't. It was an argument about what was convenient for the people doing the dismissing. The two things had nothing to do with each other, and the most dangerous thing you could do was let the first feel like the second. She had let it feel like the second. For 14 months, she had carried the weight of an institution's convenient lie, as if it reflected something true about her. That was the part she couldn't place anywhere clean, not on Harlow Vance, not on Dre, not on Hartwell. That part was on her, and she owned it without punishing herself for it. Because carrying someone else's lie was a human thing to do, and releasing it was also a human thing to do, and what mattered was that she'd eventually done both. She finished her notes. She logged out of the system. She said goodnight to Patricia, who was finishing a supply order, and nodded without looking up. The particular shorthand of people who worked together closely enough that complete attention wasn't required to communicate clearly. She was in the locker room changing when her phone buzzed. A text from Wills. Stonebridge's sentencing finalized. 12 years. Thought you'd want to know tonight. She texted back. Thanks. She put on her jacket and walked through the hospital toward the main entrance, through the corridors that had been amber-lit and strange 8 days ago, and were now just corridors again, just the ordinary infrastructure of a place where people came when their bodies needed attention. She pushed through the main entrance doors into the cold Wyoming evening. The parking lot was quiet. Most of the day shift had left an hour ago. Her car was in the third row, the same used sedan she'd driven for the last 14 months. Nothing about it changed except that she felt differently walking toward it than she had any previous evening she could remember. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment with the engine off. She thought about 31 people. She thought about the 9 whose records were currently under review, 8 of whose names she didn't know, but who were somewhere, right now, carrying the same weight she'd carried, and beginning the process of putting it down. She thought about the curriculum she was going to build, not because the Army had asked her to or because it would restore something that had been taken, but because the knowledge she had was real and specific and hard-won, and putting it somewhere durable was the best use she could make of it. She thought about Marcus Oden, who could feel his feet. She thought about Francis Adler, who had sat on a gurney in amber-lit chaos with the calm of someone who understood that the difference between panic and stillness was mostly a matter of what you chose to pay attention to. She started the car. She drove through Caldwell Ridge's downtown, past the hardware store and the diner and the VFW hall with its small illuminated sign, past the gas station and the motel, and the long flat stretch of Eastern Highway that opened up beyond the last intersection. The mountains were visible to the west, dark against a sky that still held the last edge of light at the horizon. Not dramatic, just the ordinary ending of an ordinary winter day, in a place where the sky was wide enough to make everything underneath it look proportionate. She'd spent 14 months being managed, placed and monitored and maneuvered by people who had calculated that she was easier to control than to confront. They had been wrong about that in the way that people were always wrong when they mistook endurance for passivity, when they looked at someone moving quietly through a difficult situation and concluded that the quiet meant they weren't paying attention. She had always been paying attention. That was the part they couldn't account for, and it was the part that ended them. She wasn't going to pretend it hadn't cost anything. It had cost 14 months of her life, and a record that would carry the shadow of what had been done to it even after every official document was corrected, because that was how damage worked. It left marks even after it was addressed, and the marks were real, and she was allowed to acknowledge them. She wasn't obligated to minimize what had been taken from her in order to appreciate what had been restored. Both things were true. The cost was real. The restoration was real. The work that remained, the curriculum, the shifts, the 9 people whose records were coming back to them, was real. She had learned something about power during the 14 months that she didn't think she could have learned any other way. Not that it was corrupt, which she'd known before. Not that it protected itself, which she'd also known, but that it was fragile, specifically the kind of power that operated by controlling information and managing inconvenient people was fragile in the precise way that any structure is fragile when it depends on the absence of a particular witness. She had been that witness. They had moved her, and placed her, and removed her, and none of it had changed what she'd seen at Keller Forward Base, because what she'd seen was real, and real things did not stop being real because someone found them inconvenient. That was what she would put in the training curriculum. Not just the clinical protocols, those were important, but the understanding that the most valuable thing a medic or a nurse carried into any situation was an accurate picture of what was actually happening. Not the picture that was convenient, not the picture that the hierarchy preferred, the actual picture, documented and preserved and held onto, even when every institutional signal said to let it go. Because the signal to let it go was often exactly the signal that you shouldn't. She pulled into the driveway of the rental house and sat for a moment with the engine running before she cut it. The front window was dark. She'd left no lights on when she'd gone to work this morning because she'd been running a few minutes behind and had not thought about it. She thought about it now, about going into a dark house, about the particular quality of that quiet, and she found that she didn't mind it the way she once had. The dark house was just a house. The quiet was just quiet. She knew who she was inside it, which was the thing that made the difference between solitude and loneliness, and she'd known for a while now, even on the worst days of the 14 months, that she was someone who knew things that mattered and could do things that mattered and would keep doing them regardless of what any record said. The record just said it too now. She cut the engine and went inside and turned on the kitchen light, and she stood at the counter and made tea because it was late and she'd had enough coffee, and she stood at the window with the mug in both hands and looked at the dark shape of the mountains against the sky. Tomorrow there would be a shift. There would be patients with real problems, and residents learning how to think under pressure, and a supply inventory that would need doing, and charts that required precision, and the ordinary, essential, unglamorous work of keeping people alive that she had been doing since before the army, and would be doing long after any particular chapter of her life had closed. That was not a small thing. That was the thing. It had always been the thing, and every person who had tried to manage her away from it had underestimated how thoroughly it was the center of who she was, rather than a role she occupied. They had moved her twice, out of the army, out of a hospital, and both times she had walked back in through a different door, because the door was never really the point. She finished her tea. She went to bed. In the morning, she would put on her badge and go to work. And somewhere across the country, 8 people she'd never met were beginning the process of having their records corrected. And a curriculum that didn't exist yet was taking shape in the back of her mind with the particular clarity of something that had been waiting for the right conditions to become visible. There was nothing triumphant about it. There was nothing clean or cinematic about the actual business of rebuilding after damage. It was slow and imprecise, and it left marks that persisted in ways you didn't always expect. But it was the work, and she had always been someone who showed up for the work, and no amount of institutional machinery had managed to change that about her. The people who underestimate you are counting on you to believe their estimation. That is the only power the estimation has. The moment you stop believing it, not in a dramatic declared way, but in the quiet, functional way of simply continuing to do what you know how to do, regardless of what anyone says about your right to do it. That is when the estimation collapses under its own weight, because it was never built on anything sturdier than your willingness to accept it. Claire Devlin had stopped accepting it on a morning 6 days into a suspended shift when she heard an ambulance radio in a hospital lobby and turned around. Everything else had followed from that.